A tranquil farm town is turned upside down when a frantic 911 call sends local police scrambling for answers.
I need an ambulance. Someone is bleeding.
He was shot at close range. A kill shot.
Nobody knew what happened. Nobody was saying anything.
It really hit me hard. It really, really hit me hard.
Homicide detectives are hard-pressed to nail down a suspect.
She observed a male, black, heavyset with dreadlocks fleeing from the location.
They had no success finding anybody that matched that description.
Until a slew of damning details break the case wide open.
She said, yes, she is a whore and that she had been sleeping with one of his friends.
She was always angry. She was mad and pissed off with everybody.
You could tell he was fighting some type of demon.
This wasn't her first rodeo.
Stay away from crazy-ass women.
February 8th, 2021. Ryan, Iowa. Life moves slow in this small Irish-founded town, renowned for its peaceful farm life and tight-knit community.
Ryan, Iowa is in the eastern part of Iowa, approximately 400 residents. It's only about maybe 6% Black.
It's a place where everyone knows everyone and is kind of very familial and very full of community.
You might have some thefts. Maybe somebody's cow got stolen out there or some crops gets taken, but you don't have much violent crime.
So it comes as a complete surprise when an urgent 911 call rings into the local sheriff's office around 1 a.m.
Delaware County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
It's not me, it's my neighbor downstairs. Somebody just got shot.
And just as the operator prepares to send deputies to the apartment complex, another panic call comes through.
It's the neighbor of the previous caller. She identifies herself as 33-year-old Danielle Weiner.
I need an ambulance. Someone is bleeding. They were shot in the face.
She relates that her boyfriend has just been shot, but he's still breathing.
I'm trying to keep him alive.
Okay. So do you have pressure applied to the wound?
Yes, we're pushing on the wound and to keep him alive.
She's very frantic, and while the dispatcher is trying to kind of talk Danielle down, the dispatcher then asks Danielle to check for a pulse.
Can you feel for a pulse?
It's hard for me to feel because I'm panicking. Please hurry.
Danielle's boyfriend, 27-year-old Devon Khalil Harasuelo, had an unwavering compassion for others.
Devon was one of the most sensitive people you would ever meet. He had a big heart. If he ate, you ate. He never cared about what you can bring into the plate.
Devon was my firstborn. He looked out for his sisters, his brother. Devon was always a big brother.
He was the one you went to when you needed advice.
Growing up in a modest single-parent household, Devon always strived to make his mother proud.
He always wanted to look for the next form of growth. If it was his mental well-being, his physical well-being, even with his spirituality.
Eventually, Devon began fostering ideas of running his own business.
He was into wanting to do his own stuff, be his own boss. One day he's making t-shirts. Other day he's going to the store, the thrift stores, buying books. Going back online, selling the books.
We would discuss how we can make some money, start some businesses. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met. And we always both used to tell each other, one day we're gonna change the world.
On his way to changing the world, Devon still liked to have fun.
When it came to Devon and women, he was a little bit of a playboy at times because Devon was radiant. He can walk into the room and the attention was on him and he wouldn't be trying for it.
He brought a girl home and next thing you know, you don't see her no more. You see a different girl next time. So you never see the same girl twice.
He wanted a woman that he didn't have to take care of. I mean, his mom was a strong, independent woman.
And when Devon reconnected with a childhood friend, 33-year-old Danielle Weiner, he thought he'd found just what he'd been looking for.
She was a friend of the family. I think she used to babysit him.
Danielle was 6 years older than Devon.
My daughter and her daughter went to school together. They sat on the bus together. They were each other's friends.
To Devon, Danielle seemed like the strong, persevering woman he desired in a partner.
Danielle had 2 teenage daughters and was a single mom who was kind of getting her life together.
She was in school pursuing a business administration degree and also working 2 jobs.
Before long, their friendship turned romance blossomed into a full-fledged relationship.
Devon moved into Danielle's apartment.
He was helping with the bills and taking care of the kids. That was Dee's thing, was always wanting a family.
And before long, their family began to grow.
Danielle found out she was pregnant.
Devon was so excited to have a child of his own.
Last time I saw him, we had all went out, had a big old barbecue. Danielle, her kids, her mom, dad, everybody was there.
But now, Devon is clinging to life with a gunshot wound to the face.
Danielle actually calls into the police to report that her boyfriend has gotten shot.
I'm trying to keep him alive.
She tells them, I was in my bedroom asleep and overheard him arguing with another man, and then there was a gunshot.
After the gun went off, she saw a male fleeing from the front door.
It was a black guy. He had dreads.
Black male with dreads?
Stocky. Yes, he was stocky, and they were arguing outside, and it's blood everywhere.
As Danielle remains on the line with 911, first responders arrive at the apartment.
Can I hang up the phone? He told me to hang up the phone.
Yep, that's fine. We can hang up.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay.
They see the victim laying on his back. He's in the hallway. He has an obvious gunshot wound to the left cheek.
First responders rush to Devon's aid.
But when they go to check his pulse, they come to a grim realization.
They're too late. Devon is dead.
At 27 years old, Devon Harasuelo was on his way to achieving his dreams with his girlfriend, Danielle Weiner, by his side.
He was a go-getter. He taught you how to follow both paths and to make a plan and execute that plan.
Devon and Danielle were expecting their first child together, and he couldn't wait to become a father.
But now the couple's bright future has been shattered after Devon is shot and killed inside their apartment.
When I got the phone call, it was Danielle. I'm thinking, what could she possibly have to say to me, at 2 in the morning? She told me that Devon had died. Just like that. I'm like, what are you talking about? And she's saying it again. She just said he was scrapping with this guy and the guy shot him. It really hit me hard. It really, really hit me hard.
I didn't believe it. Nobody knew what happened. Nobody was saying anything. It was just that he wasn't there.
In their search for answers, police turned to the surviving victims, Danielle Weiner and her 2 teenage daughters.
They needed to find this person quickly before there was another victim.
So they were asking her, do you know what direction he went in? Was he on foot? Did he have a vehicle?
Unfortunately, Danielle is only able to provide the same basic details she gave the 911 operator.
Danielle related to the officers that she was in the bedroom. She had heard an argument with some person at the front door.
The next thing that she knows, a gunshot goes off.
Danielle said that as she ran to the front of the apartment, She only caught a glimpse of Devon's attacker.
She observed a male, black, heavyset with dreadlocks fleeing from the location. She saw her boyfriend had been shot in the left cheek and was laying on the floor.
She wasn't sure if the shooter was on foot or in a car, and she certainly wasn't able to give a description of any vehicle.
And Danielle's teenage daughters, who were also home at the time, don't have any clues for deputies.
While this is happening, her kids are in the house. They're all asleep.
They didn't see the shooter. They didn't hear anything.
Yet even with little to go on, police are hopeful their target will be easy to track down.
Frankly, this is a primarily white community out in the middle of Iowa in the cornfields, and a large black male with dreadlocks would stand out. And if he's on foot, then there's a good chance that they would see him traveling.
So they send out as many units as their town can in order to search for this person.
Try as they might, however, deputies' hopes are soon dashed.
They had no success finding anybody that matched that description.
And police know that if the person that they're looking for left in a car, they're long gone.
As officers continue searching for the mysterious assailant, homicide detectives arrive at the crime scene to take a closer look around the home.
The first thing that they notice is that the front door is intact.
The front door was not kicked in, nor was the lock jimmied.
There wasn't anything to indicate that there was forced entry or that somebody had broken into the apartment.
Devon was shot at close range, and he was hit in the left cheek, a kill shot, which means there was little chance of survival.
They also noticed he had different scratches and scrapes, like he had got into an altercation.
The one glaring detail immediately stands out to them.
He was not positioned at the front door, as reported by the dispatcher.
Instead, he was lying in the hallway near the kitchen.
Also, his pants were down, his arms were up above his head, and his coat has been pulled up as if he was dragged to that location.
There was blood marks that also correlated with that he was dragged down the hall.
As they follow the trail of blood, detectives make a startling discovery.
As they approach the bedroom, there is a pool of blood.
They find blood splattered all over the room and on a laundry basket nearby.
That leads him to believe that this was the original crime scene.
Devon was shot in the bedroom and then moved towards the front of the home.
Which contradicts Danielle's statement.
You try to give a witness the benefit of the doubt. The adrenaline's going, and the heart rate and everything like that. They're nervous, they're afraid.
But these are some pretty big inconsistencies.
Has Danielle been lying to them?
Police in rural Ryan, Iowa, are investigating the murder of 27-year-old Devon Harrisuelo after he was brutally gunned down inside the apartment he shared with his girlfriend, Danielle Weiner.
According to Danielle, the stocky black male shot Devon shortly after an argument broke out.
But while examining the crime scene, investigators have uncovered crucial evidence contradicting Danielle's statement.
They're seeing a couple things that were a little unusual. She's telling them he was shot at the front door by this offender.
But there's a big blood spot in the bedroom, and they see that there are marks that looks like this body was drugged after the fact.
All the physical evidence so far seems to point to the crime scene being, in fact, in the bedroom.
And the bloody bedroom isn't the only evidence pointing to their new theory.
Police find a single 9mm shell casing by the bed.
They also observe an open safe in that bedroom with a gun holster and a 9mm clip.
Additionally, police notice a suitcase by the bedroom door.
It looked like it was being prepared for someone to leave.
There's blood on the floor by the closet, and they found that there was a mop, which looked like it had been used to mop blood under the door.
It's almost as if somebody's trying to clean up the crime scene.
Has Danielle been lying to police all along?
After they've collected all the evidence and went over everything, they obviously knew Danielle could possibly had some part in the situation or was covering for somebody.
But since Danielle's 2 daughters were asleep when the murder occurred and didn't witness anything, the next person detectives want to speak with is Danielle's neighbor, who also dialed 911 that night.
As we know, we've got 2 911 calls in pretty close succession, and the initial caller is the upstairs neighbor.
Detectives ask the neighbor to walk them through everything she remembers.
The neighbor said shortly after she put her kids to sleep, she heard a car door slamming.
Then, she heard 2 voices arguing downstairs.
There was some banging.
She heard somebody saying something to the effect, "Oh, my eye, you hurt my eye," or "My eye is bleeding."
Then she heard someone saying, "Get out of my house."
But suddenly the voices stopped.
And then she heard the gunfire.
The voices you heard, were they male or female?
Well, one was male and the other was definitely female.
Detectives have to wonder, did Danielle shoot Devon?
A number of things obviously have to go through your mind, but it's a little too early in the investigation to make any conclusions.
However, they obviously knew Danielle wasn't telling the truth, and at the end they decided to take her in for more questioning.
With doubts at an all-time high, police must ensure Danielle isn't concealing anything else.
As they get ready to go to the police station, the police ask Danielle to step out of the patrol car and begin to do a body search.
They searched her purse, they searched her body, and they found nothing on her.
However, before Danielle gets back in the car, something catches their eye.
Under the blanket that Danielle had been using to keep warm, now they noticed the glint of metal.
Much to the police's surprise, it was a gun, and this just simply blew the police away.
And in fact, there's blood on the barrel of this handgun.
That gun was a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, the same type that killed Devon.
During the investigation into the shooting of 27-year-old Devon Harrisuelo, Iowa police have made an alarming discovery in his girlfriend Danielle Weiner's possession.
They find a 9mm gun on her, the same type of gun used to kill Devon.
This just simply blew the police away. We now have a murder weapon found in the back of a patrol car.
Wait, I can explain.
You can explain it down at the station.
They're not messing around with Danielle anymore. She's taken into custody at this point.
Back at the station, homicide detectives sit down with Danielle.
There is a myriad of questions, so many unanswered questions, but it appears that Danielle's story at this point is falling apart at the seams.
However, detectives now face a new problem.
She went from giving the story and giving all the details to being completely uncooperative.
Danielle doesn't want to answer any questions, and she refused requests to swab her hands and clothes for evidence.
She went as far as trying to take a cup of water to wash her hands, which would wash any evidence off of her hands.
But when detectives lay out the evidence against her, They hope Danielle will have a change of heart.
Hey, informer, we got police officers out here, at risk out here searching for this suspect that you indicated, this large male black with the dreadlocks, and so far there hasn't been any location of the suspect.
It's clear now that the story she told about an unidentified man shooting Devon was just a lie.
None of the evidence that they found in the home matches what she told detectives.
There's a 9mm shell casing in your bedroom. There's a safe with a holster. There's a 9mm clip.
And the more evidence that contradicts her story and things just don't line up, the more she gets nervous and squirms.
Under the growing weight of the evidence, Danielle cracks.
She tells the officers, okay, you know what? I'm ready to cooperate. I'm going to tell you what really happened.
When it was bad, it was really bad.
She then tells the police that the relationship with Devon wasn't always roses.
For 5 years, they had dated on and off, enduring all types of highs and lows over the course of their relationship.
And when the low was low, she said it included not only emotional and verbal abuse, it included physical abuse.
According to her, he had gotten violent in the past with her on numerous occasions.
Though for a while, things seemed to be getting better.
Danielle said that after she'd gotten pregnant, Devon was much happier. They were both looking forward to having a child.
But 4 months later, tragedy struck.
Unfortunately, Danielle miscarried and lost the baby. And according to her, Devon went into a downward spiral.
She said that the abuse had gotten worse ever since she lost the baby about a month ago.
Danielle described to the police that when he drank, things got even worse.
Nobody was coming to her rescue.
Danielle says that when Devon came home last night, she could tell he had been drinking a lot.
And he was so out of control, according to Danielle.
Danielle said that she tried to talk to Devon about his behavior, but Devon wouldn't listen.
Devon called her a whore, a bitch, all types of other derogatory names.
She said he just became more belligerent, leading to the point of saying, "I'll kill you, and no one will find you in the cornfield."
In that moment, Danielle decided to fight fire with fire.
Out of anger, Danielle sarcastically said, yes, she is a whore and that she had been sleeping with one of his friends.
Danielle says that's when things took a turn for the worse.
She said he punches her so hard it knocks her glasses off.
Danielle said she told him that he needed to leave, but he tackled her.
She related that he had covered her mouth and nose, prevented her from breathing.
At that point, to defend herself, she had plunged her thumb into his eye socket and it allowed her to break free.
Danielle says she hoped that'd be the end of it, but Devon was relentless.
At some point, she managed to roll from up under him and run to her bedroom.
Once they got in there, he punched her, which caused her to fall across the other side of the bed.
According to Danielle, it was almost like Devon was possessed.
She did not even recognize who Devon was. There was a level of rage and anger and fury that kind of didn't look like the other times in which they argued.
She was for sure that he was trying to kill her. But then she remembered that the safe was open.
She says she had only one decision left to make: to live or to die.
Danielle says she managed to get a hold of the gun and fire off one shot. And that was the shot that hit Devon in his cheek.
But when she shot him in the face, she was even in shock herself.
She said she didn't even mean to shoot him in the face, but she didn't have her glasses on to see where she was aiming.
Danielle says she flew into action and dialed 911.
I need an ambulance.
Then, realizing that he was seriously hurt at that point, she really panicked, started trying to render aid to him.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep him alive. He has a pulse.
Danielle says she drugged him from the bedroom while she was on the phone with 911.
She said that she needed more space to administer first aid, so she moved him to get more space.
But if what Danielle's saying is true, why didn't she tell officers this version of the story when they first spoke with her at the crime scene?
They asked her if it was, straight self-defense thing. Why didn't you say that at the beginning?
She says she was scared and didn't want the police to blame her for what happened.
Historically, within the Black community, you kind of have this love-hate relationship with the police and this distrust.
Black women are the least likely to be believed when it is a situation in which the police are involved in general.
Ultimately, she just made a bad decision at the spur of the moment.
Danielle admits that's also why she acted so strangely after being searched.
That's the reason why she didn't want police to swab her hands and she hid the gun.
Though when it comes to the mop and smeared blood in the hallway, Danielle claims she has no idea what happened.
Danielle said that she wasn't the one who tried to mop up the blood. The cleanup job at the crime scene, Danielle doesn't have an explanation for that.
Detectives are skeptical of Danielle's version of events.
Police decide to keep her in custody as they continue trying to verify her account.
And some of her statement does check out.
Danielle does have scratches and bruises on her face as well as a busted lip.
So obviously there was some type of physical confrontation.
Devon's autopsy also lends credence to Danielle's statement.
They found out that his blood alcohol level was very high.
It was more than double the legal limit at 0.162%.
But when Devon's family comes to speak with them, investigators realize there's much more to this case than meets the eye.
The family claims that the motive in this case was not self-defense. It was jealousy.
His ex-girlfriend showed up 2 weeks before he passed. 2 weeks later, he's gone.
Murder suspect Danielle Weiner has just admitted to shooting her younger boyfriend, Devon Harrisuelo, in self-defense. But when detectives sit down with Devon's family, they say Danielle can't be trusted.
When investigators started talking to the family, they depicted their relationship in a completely different light.
They asked me about him being abusive to women. I said, Devon, he doesn't hit women.
He doesn't believe in hitting women. He's quick to walk away more than anything.
The family explains ever since Devon met Danielle, he'd been a shell of himself.
If you look at Devon before he met Danielle, he was this confident, radiant man.
Life of the party, I'm having a blast, everybody wants to be around me. And then all of a sudden, now he's showing signs of depression.
Christmas, didn't see him. New Year's, same thing.
I want to say a year and a half. He was gone. It wasn't him. That's not him.
He let his hair grow. He wouldn't comb it. He would sleep on my sofa for like days. And he wouldn't change his clothes.
Something was not right. He didn't shine. His light, he was dark. I told him, don't go back. I said, you're not happy. I said, this ain't you. You could tell he was fighting some type of demon.
According to Devon's loved ones, Danielle was known to have a short fuse.
Even though Devon never told me if she was abusive, I truly believe she was destructive.
She was always angry. She was mad and pissed off with everybody. Not just everybody, the world, her situation.
I remember hearing her over the phone one time yelling at him because he couldn't make it to be by her or something along those lines.
Supposed to act like a lady. You're not supposed to want to fight. She always want to fight everybody.
In fact, Devon's mother has her own theory behind her son's murder, and Danielle's role in it.
I believe the argument was about him leaving.
According to his mother, Devon had even met up with an old flame.
His ex-girlfriend showed up 2 weeks before he passed. And they went out, hung out for a while. 2 weeks later, he's gone. I think she found out about it, that them two were hanging out together, or maybe he wanted to leave and go back with her. I don't know. But whatever the case is, I do believe that played a part of it.
The family claims that the motive in this case was not self-defense. It was jealousy.
So who's telling the truth?
Is this a self-defense case, or is it a cold-blooded murder?
Women lie, men lie. Everything boils down to he said, she said. Who can tell the best story?
While Danielle sits in custody, it gives detectives more time to examine the clues laid out before them.
They put together a detailed timeline, and suddenly, one detail is staring them in the face.
The neighbor reported hearing a gunshot around 1:12 a.m. But Danielle didn't call 911 until 1:19 a.m.
Detectives realized that Danielle waited about a good 7 or 8 minutes before calling 911 after Devon was shot.
Did that give her time to come up with the story about the male intruder?
It was a black guy. He had dreads.
Black male with dreads?
Stocky. Yes, he was stocky.
But that's not the only detail investigators uncover that isn't sitting right with them.
Danielle was about to leave town for 6 weeks for job training, and she was going to leave her kids with Devon.
Which kind of didn't make sense to them.
I mean, if I was afraid of someone, I certainly would leave my children in their care.
None of this lined up with Danielle's depiction of Devon being a monstrous, brutal man.
It's a huge red flag for investigators, especially when they compare it to their next discovery.
They were finding out that, in fact, this wasn't her first rodeo.
She stabbed an ex-boyfriend and sent him to the hospital.
Iowa detectives investigating 33-year-old Danielle Weiner for the murder of her boyfriend, 27-year-old Devon Harrisuelo, have just learned this isn't Danielle's first run-in with the law.
They found that she actually had a prior case where she had stabbed her ex-boyfriend. Now, she didn't acquire any charges because, like this situation, she said that she was in self-defense.
Did Danielle follow the same script after the attack on Devon?
She knew what to say to, hey, I can proffer a self-defense thing here.
She manipulated the crime scene. We caught her lying.
These type of things are beginning to add up and stack up against Danielle.
And the most damning evidence of all comes straight from Danielle's mouth.
They started listening to her recorded phone calls as she was locked up, to her friends' family, and even to the kids.
Danielle is methodically crafting her self-defense case and coaching her children on what to say to police.
She made reference to her kind of aligning her story with the evidence that was presented.
She refers to Devon's body as the item, as she tells them what to say in court if they're asked to testify.
Danielle even scolded one of her daughters over the phone for talking to police.
To detectives, this doesn't sound like an innocent woman telling the truth.
These are things that someone in distress doesn't do, whether it's a mistake or not.
It sounds like a liar trying to get her story straight, to get her off the hook for shooting Devon.
At this point, detectives have little doubt that Devon was murdered in cold blood.
So they went ahead and charged Danielle with first-degree murder, and her bond was set at $1 million.
For Devon's family, Danielle's arrest is a bittersweet development in the case.
It was very painful. Very, very painful. Because it's a person that I knew. She was around my kids, around her kids, you know. So it was very hard for me. Very hard.
And when the case goes to trial on April 25th, 2023, it's far from a slam dunk.
With no eyewitness or video, there is nothing proving that Danielle lied about what happened that night. Prosecutors focus on building a powerful circumstantial case against Danielle and proving to the jury that she is nothing more than a liar who has repeatedly told lie after lie after lie.
And they agree with Danielle on one fact. The night of February 7th, 2021, a heated argument sparked everything.
What prompted the argument is still unclear, but there was an argument.
They could have been arguing about the fact that Devon was seeing his ex.
It all came to a head when Danielle told Devon to get out of her apartment, which explains the open suitcase on the bed.
But he was prepared to leave. He wasn't fighting her. He wasn't attacking her.
Prosecutors say Danielle could have simply let Devon walk out. But in a rage, she turned violent.
Danielle opened the safe and took out her 9mm handgun.
And that's when she shot him.
The prosecution asserts Danielle fired the killing blow not in self-defense, but as an act of rage.
It took 8 minutes for her to even call the police, and by the time she called the police, she already had a story.
Then she tried to hide evidence. She tried to clean up the crime scene.
In a surprising move, Danielle takes the stand in her own defense.
She was saying such things like he hit her, beat her.
She tried to make him to be this monster who battered her and did all these horrible things to her.
However, prosecutors argue Danielle's self-defense story is a cleverly calculated response.
She lied to the police on several occasions. And as a result, it was very cut and dry. She's not credible.
I know this. If she did it to save her own life, she would have said so in the beginning.
She meant to shoot him. And if your purpose was to shoot him, your intention was to kill him.
As both sides rest their case, it ultimately comes down to one question. What will the jury believe?
It only took a couple of hours for the jury to come up with their decision.
In the end, the jury decided that she was not guilty of first-degree murder.
With first-degree murder, there typically has to be a level of premeditation. She's plotting in her head, hey, I'm gonna trick him into coming into the apartment, and then I'm gonna kill him.
However, just because the crime wasn't premeditated doesn't mean Danielle isn't guilty.
They did find her, in fact, guilty of second-degree murder, which doesn't necessarily have the elements of the premeditation.
Under Iowa law, Danielle is required to serve a minimum 35-year sentence in prison.
In spite of the tragedy they've endured, the conviction comes as a relief to Devon's loved ones.
I said, thank you. I said, but wherever y'all send her, make sure it's not with the people who just found the Lord and try to live a good life. Put it with the real bad ones, the one that don't care if they live or die today or tomorrow.
I mean, at the end of the day, her life is gone. She did not just ruin one life, she ruined multiple. She destroyed a family. You know, she took something that is irreplaceable. One day she will answer. She'll have to answer to God for those crimes.
There was a time when the man who would become known as the Golden State Killer seemed almost impossible to catch. He left behind terrified victims, shattered homes, stolen property, and a trail of crime stretching across California. Yet for decades, his identity remained hidden behind a mask of ordinary life. He had no face that investigators could confidently place before the public. No name that appeared in a criminal database. No confession waiting to be discovered. No single mistake that brought him down. Instead, there was a growing collection of evidence scattered across decades, jurisdictions, and crime scenes, waiting for technology to become powerful enough to connect it. For years, detectives could only describe him through what he had done. He was a predator who entered homes at night. He watched. He planned. He waited for the right moment. And then he attacked. His crimes began in Northern California in the mid-1970s when a series of residential burglaries and sexual assaults terrified communities around Sacramento. The offender became known locally as the East Area Rapist. Later, as similar crimes appeared farther south, investigators connected him to another series of attacks and murders. The name changed. The geography changed. The decades changed. But the violence continued. Eventually, the case would become one of the most infamous unsolved investigations in American history. Then, after more than 40 years, a genetic trail would finally lead detectives to a quiet suburban home. The arrest would shock the country because the man investigators identified was not hiding in a remote location. He was living an ordinary life. He had a family. He had grown old. He had apparently moved through the world without the public knowing that one of the most wanted men in California was living among them. But before investigators could reach that moment, they had to survive decades of silence. In the beginning, there was no Golden State Killer. There were only frightened residents waking in the darkness and discovering that someone had entered their homes. The attacks were terrifying precisely because the offender seemed to understand how people live. He did not need a deserted road or an isolated building. He entered private residences, places where families believed they were safe. He watched neighborhoods. He studied routines. He learned how to approach without immediately being detected. His methods created a nightmare that spread from one community to another. In Sacramento County, women reported a man entering their homes, often after carefully preparing the environment for an attack. He sometimes removed telephone cords or disabled other means of communication. He sometimes bound victims. He created an atmosphere of control before the violence began. The fear was not limited to the moment of the assault. Victims had to live afterward with the knowledge that someone had been able to enter their most private space. Doors that had once represented security became reminders of vulnerability. Windows became potential entry points. Darkness became threatening. Ordinary nighttime sounds became impossible to ignore. Police faced a problem unlike anything they had encountered before. The offender appeared disciplined. He did not simply wander into homes randomly. He seemed to observe and prepare. He could disappear after an attack without leaving investigators with an obvious suspect. At a time when forensic technology was far less advanced than it is today, detectives depended heavily on witness descriptions, fingerprints, physical evidence, and patterns connecting separate crimes. They began trying to determine whether apparently different incidents were actually committed by the same person. That process was slow. California was vast. Police agencies were divided by jurisdiction. Information did not move with the speed investigators take for granted today. A crime in one county might initially appear unrelated to an attack hundreds of miles away. The offender benefited from those boundaries. Each investigation existed inside its own local reality. Detectives knew they were dealing with a dangerous individual, but the full scale of the pattern was difficult to see. Then, the crimes continued. The East Area Rapist became one of the most feared offenders in Northern California. His attacks generated headlines and warnings. Residents were urged to secure doors and windows. Some communities changed their routine. People became suspicious of unfamiliar vehicles and nighttime noises. The fear spread because nobody knew when the next attack would happen. The offender seemed capable of choosing homes at will. He could disappear afterward. And most terrifying of all, he appeared to understand how frightened his victims were. Investigators gradually accumulated evidence. They collected biological material. They documented crime scenes. They preserved information that might someday be useful, But at the time, the technology needed to transform that evidence into an identity did not yet exist. DNA profiling was still in its infancy. The concept that biological material could eventually produce a highly specific genetic profile was not yet part of ordinary police work. Even when investigators possessed biological evidence from attacks, they could not necessarily connect it to a person. They could sometimes establish that different crimes had been committed by the same offender, but knowing that one unknown man was responsible was not the same as knowing who that man was. That distinction would define the investigation for decades. The offender's crimes eventually expanded beyond Sacramento. In Southern California, similar attacks and murders occurred, and investigators began recognizing connections. The man who had once been known as the East Area Rapist became associated with crimes in other parts of the state. The name Golden State Killer would later capture the scale of the case because the crimes appeared to span California. But names did not stop him. Warnings did not stop him. Police investigations did not stop him. The killer remained ahead of the system. He eventually stopped committing known crimes, leaving investigators with a terrifying question. Had he died? Had he been imprisoned for another offense? Had he moved away? Had he simply stopped, or was he still living somewhere among ordinary people, carrying the secret of what he had done? For years, there was no answer. The case became cold. But cold did not mean forgotten. Detectives continued to preserve evidence. Investigators returned to old files. Families continued to remember. Survivors carried memories that could not be erased. The murders remained unresolved. The attacks remained part of California's criminal history, and somewhere in the background, an unidentified DNA profile remained connected to the crime. That profile became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. It could connect the offender to multiple crime scenes. It could establish that the same biological source was present in different cases. But it could not tell investigators his name. For decades, that was the wall they could not climb. Traditional DNA databases produced no match. The offender had apparently never submitted his DNA to the system in a way that allowed investigators to identify him. The evidence existed, but the identity remained beyond reach. Then forensic science began to change. Genetic genealogy created a possibility that investigators in the 1970s and 1980s could never have imagined. Instead of searching only for the offender himself, detectives could search for relatives. A person could remain absent from a criminal database and still leave a genetic footprint through family members who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA for ancestry research. It was a revolutionary concept, but it was also painstaking. Investigators needed to use the unknown crime scene DNA profile and compare it with genetic information available through genealogy databases. If distant relatives appeared, those relatives could become branches on a family tree. Researchers could then work backward and forward through generations using public records and family relationships to narrow the possibilities. The process did not instantly reveal a killer. It created a map. The map could contain dozens or hundreds of names. Detectives had to determine which branches mattered. They had to eliminate people who could not possibly be responsible. They had to consider age, geography, family relationships, and other circumstances. The science could point toward a family. Traditional police work still had to identify the individual. That combination would eventually change the Golden State Killer investigation forever. In 2018, investigators announced that they had arrested Joseph James Dungello, a former police officer living in Citrus Heights, California. The news was stunning. After decades of searching, detectives had identified a man they believed was responsible for the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the series of crimes later known as those of the Golden State Killer. The man accused was 72 years old. He had spent decades outside the reach of investigators. He had grown old while the case remained unsolved. And now, suddenly, the most notorious cold case in California had a suspect. The arrest was not based on a dramatic confession. It was not the result of a chance encounter. It was the culmination of forensic evidence, investigative persistence, and a revolutionary use of genetic genealogy. But the arrest was only the beginning of another chapter. Detectives still had to prove what they believed had happened. Prosecutors had to build a case spanning decades. Survivors had to confront memories that they had carried for a lifetime. Families had to revisit murders that had never received answers. And the public had to confront an unsettling question. How could a man accused of such a long series of horrific crimes have remained undetected for so many years? The answer would emerge slowly. D'Angelo had lived under an ordinary identity while investigators searched for the Golden State Killer. He had apparently built a life far removed from the terrifying image associated with the offender. That contrast became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The monster described in police files had not been living in some obviously dangerous world. He had existed inside normal society. He had aged. He had interacted with neighbors. He had gone through the routines of everyday life. Yet, according to prosecutors, beneath that ordinary exterior was the man responsible for crimes that had haunted California for decades. The arrest finally broke the silence, but it also opened the locked rooms of memory. Survivors who had spent decades wondering whether their attacker would ever be caught now had an answer. Families who had waited for justice finally had a suspect sitting behind bars. Investigators who had carried the case for years could finally place a name beside the DNA profile, and the evidence that had waited through decades of technological change was suddenly at the center of the investigation. What had once been an unidentified biological trace had become the key to identifying a living suspect. The cold case was no longer frozen in the past. It had come back to life, and as detectives reconstructed the evidence, one fact became impossible to ignore. The Golden State Killer had not been defeated by one brilliant clue discovered at the last moment. He had been defeated by evidence that survived long enough for the future to understand it. For decades, investigators had possessed pieces of the puzzle without knowing how they fit together. The crimes had been documented. The biological evidence had been preserved. The patterns had been studied. The victims had remembered. The detectives had continued searching. Then technology created the missing connection. A relative, a family tree, a name. Joseph James D'Angelo. After more than 40 years, the man investigators had been hunting finally had a face. And the moment that face became public, one of America's most haunting cold cases entered a new and terrifying phase. The search was over, but the truth was only beginning to emerge. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo in April 2018 did not feel like the end of a 40-year investigation. It felt like the moment when the past suddenly broke through the present. For decades, investigators had known the Golden State Killer only through evidence, memories, sketches, crime scene photographs, and the terrified recollections of survivors. There had been no confirmed face, no verified name, no address where detectives could knock on the door and say, "We know who you are." Then, almost overnight, that changed. A 72-year-old man was taken into custody in Citrus Heights, California, and the world learned that investigators believed the most notorious unidentified offender in the state had been living quietly in the same society he had terrorized. But the arrest was only possible because the investigation had never completely died. The evidence had been waiting. The DNA had been waiting. The victims had been waiting. And the detectives who refused to let the case disappear had kept searching for a way to connect an unknown genetic profile to a living person. The story of that breakthrough began with an uncomfortable truth. Traditional DNA databases had failed to identify the killer. Investigators had possessed a genetic profile from biological evidence connected to the crimes, but there was no direct database match. The offender had apparently never been identified through conventional forensic DNA systems. For decades, that meant the profile could confirm connections between crimes without revealing the identity behind them. The science could say, in effect, the same unknown man was involved. But it could not say who that man was. That limitation created the central mystery. Somewhere in California, perhaps somewhere far beyond the areas where the crimes had occurred, the offender might still be alive. He might have a family. He might have a job. He might have neighbors who knew nothing about his secret. He might have grown old while investigators continued searching. And if he had never entered the criminal DNA system, conventional forensic methods could continue producing the same frustrating result. No match. Then genetic genealogy changed the equation. Instead of asking whether the unknown profile matched the killer directly, investigators could ask whether it resembled DNA belonging to one of his biological relatives. That was a completely different approach. A direct search had reached a dead end. A family search could create an entirely new road. Investigators worked with genetic genealogy experts to upload or compare the crime scene profile through a public genealogy database. The objective was not to accuse the first person who appeared. It was to identify relatives. Those relatives could reveal a family tree. The family tree could reveal branches. The branches could reveal individuals. And eventually, one of those individuals could fit the circumstances of the crimes. But the process was anything but simple. A genetic match to a distant relative could produce an enormous amount of information. Families spread across generations. People marry. Names change. Children are adopted. Records contain error. A single genetic connection can lead to dozens of possible relatives. Investigators, therefore, had to combine genetic information with traditional detective work. They examined public records. They reconstructed family relationships. They studied dates and locations. They looked for individuals who could have been the offender during the relevant years. Slowly, the enormous family tree narrowed. Eventually, investigators reached the D'Angelo family. One branch pointed toward Joseph James D'Angelo. He had been born in 1945. During the years of the crimes, he had been the right age. He had lived in California. And there was something else that made the possibility especially significant. D'Angelo had worked as a police officer. That detail made the eventual arrest even more striking. The man investigators believed had committed some of the most terrifying crimes in California had once worn a uniform associated with law enforcement. A police officer was expected to understand investigative method. He would know how evidence could be collected. He would understand police procedures. He would be familiar with the dangers faced by investigators. And if prosecutors were correct, he had spent decades living with the knowledge that he had committed crimes while remaining unidentified. The image was deeply unsettling, but investigators still needed proof. Genealogy could point toward D'Angelo, but it could not be the final evidence used to establish his guilt. Detectives needed to obtain his DNA without alerting him and compare it to the crime scene profile. According to investigators, surveillance and careful evidence collection led them to discarded items associated with D'Angelo. The genetic comparison provided the critical connection. The unknown DNA profile from the decades-old crimes was linked to Joseph James D'Angelo. The man whose identity had been hidden for more than 40 years had finally been identified, but the arrest itself contained another disturbing element. D'Angelo was not discovered living under a fake identity in a remote foreign country. He was not hiding in a cabin deep in the wilderness. He was living in a suburban community. The life visible to neighbors was ordinary. The man inside that life was accused of crimes that had once terrorized entire regions of California. That contrast became one of the most haunting features of the case. It demonstrated how little appearance can reveal. For decades, survivors had carried the image of their attacker in their minds. Some remembered his voice. Some remembered his movements. Some remembered the darkness of the room, the sounds, the fear, the objects he used to control them. They had been told again and again that the investigation was continuing. Then the face of the suspect finally appeared. The old memories suddenly had a name attached to them. But the Golden State Killer investigation was much larger than one suspect. It involved a staggering number of crimes committed over many years. The offender had been known under different names in different regions. In Sacramento, he was called the East Area Rapist. In Southern California, he became known as the original Night Stalker. Later, investigators connected these crimes to the same offender and adopted the broader name Golden State Killer. Each name represented a different period in the investigation. Each name also reflected how difficult it had been to understand the full pattern. When crimes occurred across different jurisdictions, investigators did not always immediately know that they were looking at the same person. The offender benefited from geographical separation. A detective in one county might see one pattern, while another detective hundreds of miles away saw something different. Communication improved over time, but the case had already grown complicated. The offender had also changed his methods and locations. The murders in Southern California added another terrifying dimension to the investigation. Now the case was no longer only about sexual assaults and burglaries. It involved homicide. Families had lost loved ones. Survivors had to live with the knowledge that the person who attacked them had also killed. The stakes became enormous. The Golden State Killer was not merely a serial offender who had escaped identification. He was a murderer accused of taking multiple lives, yet the case remained unsolved for decades. That fact created a psychological burden that extended far beyond law enforcement. Every time another year passed, the possibility of justice seemed to fade. Survivors aged. Families grew old. Some people who had once worked on the investigation retired. Some died without knowing whether the killer would ever be identified. The case became part of California's collective memory. It appeared in books, documentaries, newspaper investigations, and true crime discussions. The offender became almost mythical. He was described as cunning, elusive, and extraordinarily difficult to catch. But the arrest exposed something different. He was human. He had a name. He had a home. He had a history. And investigators had finally found the biological path connecting him to the crimes. For the survivors, however, the discovery created complicated emotions. Some felt relief. Some felt anger. Some struggled to process the fact that the person they had feared for decades was suddenly sitting in a jail cell. Others were confronted with a disturbing realization. They had spent their lives carrying memories of an attacker who had continued living while they had lived with the consequences. The passage of time had affected everyone differently. D'Angelo had grown old. The victims had grown old. Children had become grandparents. Communities had changed, but the memories remained. When the suspect was arrested, those memories returned with force. The legal process would soon require survivors to revisit the crimes in public. They would have to describe events that had happened decades earlier. They would have to look at the accused man in court. They would have to confront the person prosecutors said had been responsible for some of the worst moments of their lives. The case, therefore, entered a new stage. The detective work had produced an arrest. Now the justice system had to prove the accusations. Prosecutors had to organize evidence from crimes spanning decades. They had to connect the biological evidence to specific incidents. They had to establish patterns while respecting the legal requirements of each charge, and they had to prepare for a courtroom filled with people whose lives had been changed by the accused. Meanwhile, D'Angelo's identity raised questions about how he could have remained undetected. How could someone accused of committing crimes across multiple California communities build a normal life afterward? How could he interact with neighbors and family members while carrying the knowledge of what investigators said he had done? How had he avoided detection for so long? Part of the answer was the simple passage of time. The crimes had occurred before modern databases, widespread surveillance cameras, and advanced genetic genealogy. Investigators in the 1970s and 80s were working with tools that now seem primitive. There was no internet connecting every public record. There were no consumer genealogy databases containing millions of genetic profiles. There were no smartphones recording movements. There was no modern system capable of instantly connecting information from different jurisdictions. The Golden State Killer had committed his crimes in an era when technology gave investigators fewer ways to connect the dots. But another part of the answer was that the evidence required time to become meaningful. The DNA profile existed long before investigators could identify the person behind it. The killer had not necessarily defeated science. He had benefited from the limits of science at the time. That distinction would become one of the central lessons of the case. The investigation was not solved because detectives suddenly discovered a forgotten clue hidden in a drawer. It was solved because a new generation of forensic technology could interpret evidence collected decades earlier. The past had been preserved well enough for the future to understand it. And that future had arrived in 2018 when D'Angelo was arrested. The decades of uncertainty suddenly had a focal point. The Golden State Killer was no longer an anonymous predator in an old case file. He was a 72-year-old man standing accused of crimes that had haunted California for more than 40 years. The arrest was dramatic, but the real shock was what came next. Investigators and prosecutors began reconstructing the enormous history of violence connected to him. Survivors began preparing to face him. Families began preparing to speak about loved ones they had lost. And the public began learning the scale of a case that had once seemed almost impossible to solve. The genetic genealogy breakthrough had opened the door. But behind that door was a history stretching back to the 1970s. Every crime scene, every survivor, every unanswered question, and every piece of preserved evidence now demanded attention. The man had finally been found, but the story of what he had done was only beginning to emerge. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo transformed a case that had lived for decades in the darkness of uncertainty into a criminal investigation with a living suspect. But the deeper investigators looked, the more overwhelming the history became. This was not a single crime. It was not a single neighborhood. It was not one night that could be reconstructed from a handful of witnesses. It was a sprawling pattern of violence that had crossed years, counties, and generations, leaving behind survivors who had carried the memory long after the offender disappeared from view. For the people who had spent decades asking whether the man who attacked them would ever be identified, the answer had finally arrived. But the answer came with another question. What exactly had investigators connected to D'Angelo, and how much of the terrifying history attributed to the Golden State Killer could be proven in court? The investigation reached back to the earliest known attacks in the Sacramento area during the 1970s. At that time, the offender was known as the East Area Rapist. He targeted residential neighborhoods, often selecting homes where women or couples appeared vulnerable. His behavior created a distinctive atmosphere of terror. He was not simply breaking into houses. According to investigators and survivors, he appeared to study his victims and prepare carefully before attacking. The knowledge that someone had been watching from outside made the fear even more intense. People began changing their routines. Doors were reinforced. Windows were checked repeatedly. Families became suspicious of sounds in their yards. A neighborhood that had once represented safety could suddenly feel like a trap. The offender seemed to understand that fear itself could become a weapon. He could enter a home and immediately establish control. Victims later described the psychological terror of being unable to predict what he would do next. For investigators, the challenge was equally frightening. They were dealing with an offender who appeared methodical and who repeatedly escaped without being identified. Biological evidence was recovered in some cases, and investigators eventually recognized that the same offender was responsible for multiple attacks. But knowing that one man was committing the crimes did not tell them his name. The evidence created a profile without an identity. That distinction became the defining frustration of the investigation. Detectives could connect crimes together, but they could not put a face to the unknown man. As the attacks continued, the offender's behavior changed. His crimes eventually extended into other parts of California, and murders became part of the pattern. In Southern California, investigators encountered a series of killings associated with an offender they called the original Night Stalker. At first, the different crime series were not universally understood as the work of one person. Different jurisdictions had different investigators. Different victims lived hundreds of miles apart. Different names were used. But over time, evidence and investigative work established connections between the cases. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were eventually understood to be the same offender. The broader term Golden State Killer captured the enormous geographical reach of the crime. Yet even as investigators increasingly understood the scale of the case, the offender remained unidentified. Then something changed. The murders stopped. The sexual assaults stopped. The burglaries stopped. There was no known final confrontation, no dramatic shootout, no arrest, no confession. The offender simply disappeared from the known criminal landscape. For investigators, this created another mystery. Why had he stopped? Had he died? Had he been imprisoned for an unrelated offense? Had he left California? Had he simply decided that the risks were too great? Nobody knew. The case entered a long period of silence. Years became decades. The surviving victims grew older. Their children grew older. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited old files. The Golden State Killer became one of those cases that seemed almost impossible to solve. Yet the DNA evidence remained. That evidence was more important than it initially appeared. In a modern investigation, a biological profile can become a powerful identifier. In the 1970s, however, investigators did not have that capability. Even later, when DNA profiling became available, the unknown profile did not produce an immediate name. It could establish that biological evidence from different crime scenes came from the same male. But if that man's DNA was not already in a law enforcement database, the trail ended. The case remained stuck behind an invisible wall. Investigators had the offender's genetic signature, but they had no way to connect that signature to a person. That changed with the rise of consumer genetic genealogy. People began submitting DNA to companies for ancestry research and family history. The databases were created for ordinary people seeking information about their heritage, relatives, and biological connection. But investigators realized that the same genetic relationships could potentially help identify unknown criminal suspects. The concept was revolutionary and controversial. Instead of finding the offender directly, investigators could find members of his family. A distant cousin might be enough to begin reconstructing a genealogical tree. That tree could eventually narrow the possibilities until investigators reached the person whose age, location, and history fit the crime. In the Golden State Killer case, the unknown crime scene DNA became the starting point for that process. Investigators worked with genetic genealogy experts to search for potential relatives. The first results did not provide an instant answer. They provided connections. Connections became family trees. Family trees became names. Names became possibilities, and possibilities were investigated one by one. This was detective work performed on a scale that would have been impossible decades earlier. Investigators were no longer limited to the people they already suspected. They were following biological relationships into the unknown. Eventually, the search led toward the D'Angelo family. Joseph James D'Angelo emerged as a possible candidate. He had been born in 1945. During the years of the attacks, he was within the relevant age range. He had lived in California, and his history contained another detail that investigators found particularly striking. D'Angelo had served as a police officer. That meant he was not unfamiliar with law enforcement. He had knowledge of police procedures and an understanding of how investigators might approach a crime scene. The revelation added another disturbing layer to the case, but investigators could not simply arrest a man because he fit a genealogy profile. They needed direct evidence. They needed his DNA. Detectives began conducting surveillance. They watched D'Angelo. They needed to obtain biological material from him without alerting him to the investigation. According to investigators, discarded items provided the opportunity. A genetic comparison was conducted. The result connected D'Angelo to the crime scene DNA. The unknown man finally had a name. The arrest followed on April 24, 2018. Police arrived at D'Angelo's home in Citrus Heights and took him into custody. He was 72 years old. More than 4 decades had passed since the earliest known attack. The photographs of his arrest stunned the public. The Golden State Killer was no longer an anonymous figure described through composite sketches. He was an elderly man being escorted away from an ordinary suburban home. The contrast was almost surreal. For decades, California had imagined the offender as a shadow moving through darkness. Now that shadow had a driver's license, a house, a history, and a name. But for survivors, the arrest was far more than a dramatic news event. It was the reopening of memories they had spent decades trying to live with. Some victims had never believed they would see the day the offender was caught. Others had continued following the investigation even when the case seemed hopeless. Some had wondered whether the man who attacked them was already dead. Others had wondered whether he was living nearby. The arrest answered one question while creating another emotional challenge. Now they would have to face the accused. They would have to hear his name. They would have to watch his court appearances. And eventually, some would have to confront him directly. For families of murder victims, the emotions were even more complicated. Their loved ones had never received justice. The murders had remained unresolved while the families continued their lives without answers. Now the arrest reopened the wounds of the past. The suspect was no longer a mysterious figure. He was a specific man accused of crimes that had destroyed families decades earlier. Investigators also faced an enormous task. They had to connect the suspect to individual crimes, many of which had occurred before modern evidence handling practices were standardized. Files had to be reviewed. Physical evidence had to be re-examined. DNA results had to be interpreted. Investigators had to identify which cases could be supported by the available evidence. The passage of time created problems everywhere. Some witnesses were dead. Some records were difficult to locate. Some memories had changed. But the biological evidence remained powerful. It had survived the decades, and it was not merely evidence of a theory, it was evidence capable of establishing a direct biological connection. That made the prosecution's task different from the investigations of the 1970s. The original detectives had been trying to identify an unknown offender. Modern investigators were trying to prove that the unknown offender and Joseph James D'Angelo were the same person. The science had already answered the identity question. The courtroom would have to deal with the consequences. Then came another extraordinary revelation. Investigators began connecting D'Angelo to a much larger number of crimes than the public initially understood. The Golden State Killer investigation had accumulated dozens of cases across California. Some were attacks, some were burglaries, some were murders. Each case represented another victim, another family, another night that had never truly ended. The offender had not simply disappeared from history. His crimes had remained scattered across police files. Now investigators were bringing them together. The full picture was becoming clearer, and the more cases were connected, the more astonishing the decades-long evasion appeared. How had one man managed to commit so many crimes and remain unidentified for so long? How had the investigation failed to reach him? And how had he managed to live an apparently ordinary life after the violence ended? These questions became central to the public fascination with the case. But behind the headlines were people who had spent decades carrying the consequences. For them, this was never simply a mystery. It was their life. The night the offender entered their homes was still part of their personal history. The murders were still present in family memories. The arrest did not erase those years. It simply changed the person at the center of them. And now the case was moving toward a courtroom where survivors would have an opportunity that had been impossible for decades. They would finally be able to look directly at the man prosecutors said had terrorized them and demand accountability. The evidence had found him. The genealogy had found him. The DNA had found him. But justice still required something more. It required the stories of the people who had survived, the families who had lost loved ones, and the evidence that could transform a 40-year mystery into a legally established record. The Golden State Killer had finally been pulled from the shadows. Now the shadows were going to be forced into the light. The case against Joseph James D'Angelo began to take on a different shape once the initial shock of his arrest faded. For decades, the Golden State Killer had existed as a frightening silhouette in California's collective memory. Now investigators had a name, a face, and a biological connection to the crime scene. But identifying a suspect was only the beginning. The next challenge was to establish the scale of the crimes and determine which cases could be tied to D'Angelo through evidence strong enough to survive a courtroom. The investigation stretched backward through more than 40 years, and every file carried a different story. Every survivor remembered something different. Every family had its own loss. Every crime scene contained its own fragments. Yet investigators believed those fragments belonged to the same man. The question was whether they could prove it. The earliest known attacks attributed to the offender had occurred in the Sacramento area during the 1970s. At the time, the crimes were terrifying, but still difficult to connect. The offender moved through residential neighborhoods, often targeting homes at night. His behavior suggested planning. He appeared to understand how to approach a house without drawing attention and how to control victims once inside. The attacks created an atmosphere of fear that spread far beyond the individual homes. Residents began locking doors more carefully. People changed sleeping arrangements. Some families installed additional security. The possibility that an unknown man could enter a home while its occupants slept destroyed the sense of safety that ordinary neighborhoods depended on. Police departments responded with increased patrols and warning. Investigators searched for patterns. They interviewed victims and witnesses. They collected physical evidence, but the offender repeatedly escaped identification. The crimes became increasingly sophisticated in the sense that the offender appeared to learn from experience. Investigators could see patterns in his behavior, but those patterns did not reveal his name. The attacks expanded. Crimes in different parts of California began to reveal similarities. Eventually, investigators connected the East Area rapist with crimes attributed to the original Night Stalker. What had once appeared to be separate investigations became part of one enormous case. The offender had not merely operated in one community, he had moved across the state. The geographical expansion made the investigation more complicated, but it also eventually gave detectives a larger body of evidence to work with. Multiple crime scenes could be compared. Biological evidence could be analyzed. Investigators could establish whether the same offender was responsible for apparently unrelated crimes. The DNA evidence became especially important because it created a biological signature. The same unknown male profile could be associated with multiple attacks and murders. That was powerful. It meant investigators knew that the crimes were connected, but they still did not know who the person was. The profile was like a fingerprint without a name. It could tell investigators that the same man was present, but it could not tell them where he lived. For years, that distinction seemed insurmountable. Then technology changed the investigation. Genetic genealogy offered a way to search beyond traditional criminal databases. Investigators could use the unknown DNA profile to identify distant relatives. Those relatives could provide the first branches of a family tree. The family tree could then be reconstructed through public records. Each generation created new possibilities. Each marriage and birth added information. Eventually, investigators could narrow the field to a person who fit the historical circumstances. That person was Joseph James D'Angelo, but the genealogy did not become the final answer until detectives obtained a direct DNA comparison. They needed evidence linking D'Angelo personally to the biological material recovered from the crimes. Investigators watched him. They searched for discarded biological material. When they obtained a sample, the result provided the connection they needed. The unknown profile and D'Angelo were linked. The man who had remained unidentified since the 1970s was finally known. The arrest in April 2018 created an extraordinary scene. D'Angelo was 72 years old. He was taken into custody at his home in Citrus Heights. For the public, the images were almost impossible to reconcile with the mythology surrounding the Golden State Killer. The suspect was an elderly man. He did not resemble the composite sketches that had circulated decades earlier. He looked like someone who could disappear into an ordinary suburban street without attracting attention. That contrast became one of the most unsettling elements of the investigation. The offender had apparently been able to lie for decades under the protection of anonymity. But now the anonymity was gone. Detectives began reviewing the entire case with D'Angelo at its center. The task was enormous. Investigators had to revisit old crime scenes through records and preserved evidence. They had to locate survivors and witnesses. They had to examine forensic material that had been stored for decades. They had to determine which crimes could be directly connected to D'Angelo and which remained outside the formal case. The biological evidence gave investigators an extraordinary advantage. They did not have to rely entirely on memories from the 1970s. DNA could provide objective connections, but DNA could not answer every question. It could establish a biological presence. It could not explain intent. It could not describe every action. It could not tell investigators exactly what happened inside a house. That is where witness testimony became critical. Survivors who had once been frightened young people were now older adults. They had carried the memory of the offender for decades. Some remembered details with remarkable clarity. Others had understandably struggled with memories that had been buried under years of life. The prosecution would eventually need to present those experiences in court. That meant asking survivors to revisit some of the most traumatic moments of their lives. The case was therefore becoming not only a forensic investigation, but a human one. Every crime represented a person whose life had been divided into before and after. Before the attack, there had been an ordinary evening. Afterward, there was fear. There were security routines. There were memories. There were questions about whether the offender would return. There was the uncertainty of not knowing whether he had been caught. Some survivors lived for decades without knowing whether the man who attacked them was still alive. Others wondered whether they had passed him on the street without recognizing him. The arrest changed that uncertainty, but it also forced the survivors to confront something they had spent years trying to avoid. Their attacker had a face. He had a name. He was sitting in court. The prosecution eventually presented a case involving multiple murders and numerous sexual assaults. The sheer number of victims made the proceedings extraordinary. Prosecutors had to decide how to organize the evidence and how to represent the history without overwhelming the court. Each crime had to be connected to evidence. Each charge had to be supported, and the prosecution had to demonstrate that the man sitting before the court was the same person responsible for crimes committed decades earlier. The DNA evidence was central. So was the pattern of behavior. The crimes showed similarities in the offender-esque method. The locations and circumstances provided additional context, but the strongest foundation remained the biological evidence. Modern forensic science had created the link that investigators in the 1970s could not. D'Angelo's arrest also raised an unsettling question about his former career. He had worked as a police officer in California. That meant he had been familiar with law enforcement from the inside. He would have known how police investigated crimes. He would have understood the significance of evidence. He would have known that investigators search for patterns. The possibility that a person with that knowledge could commit crimes and remain unidentified for decades became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Yet his employment history also demonstrated how little an ordinary biography can reveal about a person's hidden behavior. To neighbors, he could appear ordinary. To the community, he was an older man. To investigators, he was now the suspected perpetrator of one of the most notorious crime series in American history. That contradiction made the case even more difficult for the public to comprehend. The arrest did not immediately provide emotional closure. Survivors had waited too long for that. Some had built entire lives around the assumption that the offender would never be caught. They had married, raised children, changed careers, moved to different communities, and grown older. The crime remained a part of them, but life continued around it. Then, in 2018, the past suddenly returned. News reports carried D'Angelo's name. Old photographs resurfaced. Survivors realized that the person they had feared for decades was no longer anonymous. Families of murder victims faced an equally powerful moment. For years, they had lived without knowing who had killed their loved ones. Now there was a suspect. But because the murders had happened decades earlier, many relatives had spent their entire lives waiting. Some had died before the arrest. Some had never seen the day arrive. Justice delayed had become a form of grief in itself. The investigation therefore carried an emotional burden that no modern technology could erase. DNA could identify a suspect, but it could not give lost years back. Genetic genealogy could connect a family tree, but it could not restore a victim's future. An arrest could create accountability, but it could not undo what had happened. The case was moving toward justice, but justice could not turn back time. As prosecutors prepared for court, investigators continued reviewing evidence. The public learned more about the scale of the crimes. The term Golden State Killer became synonymous with a decades-long mystery finally solved through modern science. But the more evidence emerged, the more apparent it became that the case was not simply a story about a clever detective breakthrough. It was also a story about persistence. The original investigators had collected evidence that would not reveal its value for decades. Forensic scientists had preserved and analyzed biological material. Later investigators had refused to accept that an unknown DNA profile had to remain unknown forever. Genetic genealogists had developed methods for turning genetic relationships into investigative leads. Detectives had followed those leads carefully, and eventually the pieces converged. The arrest was the visible moment. The real breakthrough had been building quietly for years. It had begun with evidence collected in the darkness of old crime scenes. It continued through databases and laboratories. It moved through family trees. It ended at a suburban home in California, but the most difficult chapter was still ahead. The survivors were preparing to speak. The courtroom would become the place where decades of fear would be transformed into testimony. The man accused of hiding behind an ordinary life would have to face the people whose lives had been changed by his action. And after more than 40 years of silence, the voices of the victims were about to become the most powerful part of the case. By the time the case moved toward the courtroom, the identity of Joseph James D'Angelo was no longer the central mystery. The DNA evidence had done what generations of investigators had been unable to do. It had connected a name to the biological profile recovered from the crimes. But identification was only the beginning of justice. The next question was what would happen when the survivors finally faced the man they had spent decades trying to forget. For many of them, the passage of time had created a strange distance from the crimes. The attacks belonged to another era. The houses had changed. Neighborhoods had changed. Children had grown up. People who had once been young had become grandparents. Yet the memories had never truly disappeared. A locked door at night could still carry a different meaning. A sound outside a bedroom window could still awaken an old fear. The arrest in 2018 brought those memories rushing back into the present. Suddenly, the unknown offender had a name. Joseph James D'Angelo. Suddenly, the man who had existed for decades as a shadow in police files was sitting in a courtroom. The Golden State Killer was no longer a mystery. He was an accused defendant, and for the survivors, that transformation was profound. They had waited for an answer, but they now had to decide what to do with it. The legal process moved slowly because the case was enormous. Prosecutors were dealing with crimes committed across multiple California counties over many years. Evidence had to be organized. Jurisdictional issues had to be addressed. Survivors and families had to be contacted. The prosecution needed to determine how the case could proceed while respecting the enormous amount of history involved. Then, in June 2020, the proceedings took a dramatic turn. D'Angelo admitted responsibility in court. He pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges. The plea agreement allowed prosecutors to secure convictions without putting survivors through lengthy trials on every individual case. It was an extraordinary development because it meant the courtroom would not have to determine whether D'Angelo was responsible for every crime through a separate contested trial. Instead, he acknowledged responsibility for the charged offense, but the plea did not mean the victims' stories would disappear. Quite the opposite. The sentencing proceedings became an opportunity for survivors and relatives of victims to speak directly about what the crimes had done to their lives. For decades, the offender had controlled the narrative through now the survivors controlled the room. They were no longer anonymous victims in old police reports. They were witnesses to history. They had survived, and they were ready to tell the court what the crimes had cost them. The setting was dramatically different from the homes where the attacks had occurred. There were no dark bedrooms, no broken routines, no terrified families trying to understand what had happened. Instead, there was a courtroom filled with people who had carried those memories for decades. D'Angelo sat before them as an elderly man. The image was difficult to reconcile with the offender described in the original police report, but for the survivors, the physical appearance did not matter. They remembered the person who had entered their lives without permission. They remembered the fear. They remembered the aftermath. The years had changed the world around them, but they had not erased what happened. Their victim impact statements became one of the most powerful elements of the entire case. Some survivors spoke about the immediate terror of the attacks. Others described the long-term consequences. Some explained how the crimes affected relationships, sleep, trust, and their sense of safety. The words were not simply about individual nights. They were about decades. The offender had committed his crimes in minutes or hours, but the consequences had continued for a lifetime. That imbalance became impossible to ignore. A single night could create 40 years of fear. A single attack could alter the way a person viewed their own home forever. A murder could leave a family grieving across generations. The courtroom gave those people an opportunity to reverse the imbalance. D'Angelo could no longer control the moment. He could not hide behind darkness. He could not disappear into a neighborhood. He had to listen. The survivors spoke. Their families spoke. The dead could not speak, but relatives spoke for them. Their voices filled the space that had once been occupied by uncertainty. The sentencing process also revealed the enormous scale of the suffering connected to the case. Although the charges covered a specific number of crimes, the broader investigation had connected D'Angelo to many more attacks. Authorities had long attributed dozens of sexual assaults and burglaries to the Golden State Killer. Some survivors chose not to participate in the legal proceedings. Others had died before the suspect was ever identified. Some families had spent decades believing that they might never know who was responsible. The plea agreement, therefore, represented something more than a conventional conviction. It provided a formal acknowledgement of responsibility for the charged crimes while sparing many victims the ordeal of cross-examination and years of additional litigation. But there was another extraordinary element. D'Angelo's guilty plea came after he had spent decades refusing to reveal himself. The man who had avoided identification for more than 40 years now stood in court and admitted responsibility. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. For decades, investigators had been asking the public for information about an unknown offender. Now the offender was standing before a judge. The mystery had become a confession. Yet the confession did not erase the need for evidence. The DNA identification remained one of the most important breakthroughs in the case because it had made the arrest possible in the first place. Without genetic genealogy, D'Angelo might have remained anonymous for the rest of his life. Without the biological evidence preserved from decades earlier, investigators would not have had the genetic profile needed to begin the search. The final result depended on a chain that stretched from old crime scenes to modern laboratories. That chain began with evidence collected when forensic science was still developing. It continued through years of database searches that produced no direct match. Then, genetic genealogy provided an entirely new strategy. The unknown profile became connected to relatives. The relatives became a family tree. The family tree pointed toward D'Angelo. Detectives obtained a direct sample. The DNA matched. The suspect was arrested. Then, 2 years later, he pleaded guilty. The sequence was extraordinary because every stage depended on the one before it. Remove the preserved DNA, and there is no genetic profile. Remove the profile, and there is no genealogy search. Remove the genealogy search, and investigators may never reach D'Angelo. Remove the direct comparison, and the genealogical connection remains only an investigative lead. The power of the case came from the combination. Science created the path. Detective work followed it. The courtroom completed the process. Yet the emotional heart of the case remained with the survivors. They had been living with the consequences long before the Golden State Killer became a national headline. Their stories had existed before the documentaries, before the books, before the arrest, before the genetic genealogy breakthrough. Some had spent decades wondering whether anyone believed them. Others had wondered whether the offender would ever be caught. Some had lived with the terrible possibility that he might still be nearby. The arrest finally removed that uncertainty, but it also forced them to confront the reality that the man they feared had continued living a life while they carried the consequences of what he had done. The sentencing hearings brought that contradiction into sharp focus. D'Angelo was elderly. Many of the survivors were also old. The people standing in the courtroom were not the same people they had been when the crimes occurred. The passage of time was visible on every face, but the memories were still present. The courtroom, therefore, became a meeting point between two different versions of history. There was the past, when D'Angelo allegedly moved through California as the Golden State Killer. And there was the present, when survivors stood before him and demanded accountability. The old fear had been transformed into confrontation. The silence had been transformed into testimony. The unknown had been transformed into a name, and the name had been transformed into a guilty plea. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The sentence formally ended the criminal prosecution arising from the charged crimes. But even then, the story did not feel simple. There was no celebration. There could not be. Too many people had been killed. Too many lives had been altered. Too many years had been lost. Justice had arrived, but it arrived after decades of suffering. The sentence could not restore the murdered victim. It could not return the stolen years. It could not erase the memories of those who survived. It could not undo the fear that had shaped entire lives. What it could do was establish accountability. The man who had remained unidentified for decades would spend the rest of his life in prison. The courtroom record would no longer contain an unanswered mystery. The victims would no longer have to wonder whether the offender would ever be identified. Families could finally say that the person responsible had been held accountable. For investigators, the conviction also represented a remarkable conclusion to one of the longest and most difficult investigations in American criminal history. But the case left behind lessons that reached far beyond California. The Golden State Killer demonstrated the power of preserving evidence. It demonstrated the importance of revisiting cold cases. It demonstrated how genetic genealogy could transform investigations when traditional databases failed. And it demonstrated something even more important. Technology can change, but evidence can endure. The biological material collected decades earlier did not become more truthful over time. Investigators simply gained better tools for understanding it. That distinction matters because cold cases often appear dead only because the available technology has reached its limit. A case may contain evidence that seems useless today but becomes decisive tomorrow. The Golden State Killer investigation showed that possibility in extraordinary detail. The evidence survived the 1970s. It survived the 1980s. It survived the 1990s. It survived the beginning of the new century, and eventually, it survived long enough for genetic genealogy to turn an anonymous profile into a family connection, then into a suspect, then into an arrest, then into a confession, then into a sentence. The journey took more than 40 years. The victims did not receive immediate justice. Their families did not receive immediate answers. But the evidence waited, and when the technology finally caught up, the past opened. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of the case was not the arrest or even the guilty plea. It was the realization that the man investigators had hunted for so long had been aging quietly while the people he had harmed were carrying his crimes in their memory. The Golden State Killer had disappeared from the crime scenes, but he had never truly disappeared from the lives of his victim. He remained present in the fear, in the memories, in the locked doors, and in the unanswered questions. Then the DNA trail brought him back into the light. His identity became known. His victims became visible again, and the story was no longer controlled by the killer. It belonged to the people who survived him. Their voices became the final evidence of what the crimes had really meant. The Golden State Killer had spent decades hiding behind anonymity. But when the courtroom doors finally closed around him, the anonymity was gone forever. The man who had once been only a profile, a sketch, a nickname, and a nightmare now had a documented identity and a sentence that would last for the rest of his life. And for those who had waited more than 40 years, the most important transformation was simple. They no longer had to wonder whether the killer would ever be found. He had been found. He had been identified. He had been confronted. And finally, he had been held accountable. The courtroom had finally given the Golden State Killer a name, a face, and a sentence, but the case still carried the weight of everything that could never be restored. For more than 4 decades, the crimes had existed in 2 different worlds. In one world were the official records, the police reports, the forensic evidence, the photographs, the sketches, and the unanswered questions. In the other were the private memories of the people who had survived. Those memories did not sit quietly inside filing cabinets. They lived in bedrooms, in locked doors, in sleepless nights, in family conversations, and in moments when an ordinary sound could suddenly transport someone back to a terrifying night decades earlier. The arrest had connected those 2 worlds. The evidence in the files now had a face. The memories now had a name, and the man at the center of the investigation could no longer disappear behind the anonymity that had protected him for so long. But before the case could truly close, investigators and prosecutors had to confront the full history of the crimes and understand how an offender could remain unidentified for so many years. The answer was not one perfect escape. It was a combination of time, geography, limited technology, changing investigative methods, and the simple fact that the offender had managed to avoid leaving behind the kind of evidence that could immediately reveal his identity. In the 1970s, police work looked very different. Investigators relied heavily on interviews, physical descriptions, fingerprints, shoe impressions, vehicle information, handwritten records, and forensic techniques that were far less advanced than those available decades later. The concept of DNA profiling that would eventually transform criminal investigations had not yet become a practical tool for identifying unknown suspects. When investigators collected biological evidence from the crimes, they were preserving something whose full value could not yet be understood. That evidence would later become the thread connecting the beginning of the investigation to its extraordinary conclusion. But for years, the thread seemed to lead nowhere. The East Area Rapist had become one of the most feared offenders in Northern California. His crimes generated intense police activity and widespread public fear. Communities were warned. Residents changed their routines. People who had never previously thought twice about locking a window began checking every possible entrance before going to sleep. The fear was particularly powerful because the offender attacked places that were supposed to be safe. He did not need a deserted alley or an isolated location. He entered homes. He violated the boundary between public and private life. For victims, the danger was not somewhere distant. It was inside the place where they slept. That psychological impact lasted long after the offender disappeared. Even when the attack stopped, the uncertainty remained. Nobody knew whether he had simply moved elsewhere or whether he had abandoned his crimes. Investigators could not announce that the threat was gone because they did not know why it had stopped. The case, therefore, remained open in a strange state. There was no active offender appearing in the news, but there was also no arrest, no definitive explanation, no courtroom, no sentence. The Golden State Killer had become a ghost. Then, decades later, forensic technology began to change the meaning of the evidence. DNA profiling had become a central part of modern criminal investigation. Investigators could extract genetic information from biological material and compare profiles with known individuals. But even that advancement was not enough at first. The Golden State Killer's profile did not match a person in the available criminal databases. The technology could identify the same unknown man across different crime scenes, but it could not tell investigators who he was. The case had reached another wall. The wall was different from the one faced by the original detectives, but it was still a wall. Investigators had a highly valuable genetic profile and nowhere obvious to take it. Then came genetic genealogy. The development changed the investigation because it allowed detectives to think about DNA in a completely different way. Instead of searching for a direct match, they could look for biological relatives. That meant the person who uploaded DNA did not need to be the offender. A distant cousin could be enough. A shared ancestor could be enough. A family connection could become the first branch of a tree that eventually led to the unknown suspect. It was a revolutionary approach, but it demanded patience and precision. A genetic connection was not proof of guilt. It was a clue. Investigators had to build a family tree and determine which individuals could realistically fit the profile. They had to consider generations of relatives, geographic locations, ages, and historical circumstances. They had to separate the useful information from an enormous amount of genetic noise. Eventually, Joseph James D'Angelo emerged as a candidate, but the genealogy alone was not enough. Detectives needed direct evidence. They watched him. They studied his movements. They searched for an opportunity to obtain biological material without alerting him. When they succeeded, the comparison produced the result that had eluded investigators for more than 40 years. D'Angelo's DNA was consistent with the crime scene evidence. The anonymous profile had become a person. The arrest that followed was therefore not a lucky break. It was the final link in a chain that stretched across generations of forensic science. Yet the public reaction revealed another disturbing dimension of the case. D'Angelo had lived in a suburban community. He was not hiding behind a notorious criminal alias. He was not living as an obvious fugitive. He had grown old. He had a family history. He had spent years in ordinary surroundings. And according to prosecutors, beneath that ordinary appearance was the man responsible for a series of crimes that had terrorized California. The contrast forced people to reconsider one of the most uncomfortable realities of cold cases. A dangerous offender does not necessarily look dangerous. A person can live an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary secret. The Golden State Killer case made that contradiction painfully visible. But for investigators, the appearance of normality was less important than the evidence. The DNA did not care how old D'Angelo was. It did not care what his neighbors thought of him. It did not care how ordinary his life appeared. The genetic profile connected him to the biological evidence. Then the legal process began. Prosecutors had to present the case in a way that could withstand scrutiny. The passage of time made everything more difficult. Witnesses had aged. Memories had survived for decades. But memories can change. Records had to be located. Evidence had to be reviewed. Investigators had to determine which cases could be prosecuted and which could be established through available evidence. The sheer number of crimes made the task enormous. The Golden State Killer investigation had never been a single case in the traditional sense. It was a constellation of crimes that investigators gradually learned belonged together. Each crime had its own victims. Each had its own circumstances. Each had its own investigative history. Connecting them into a coherent prosecution required years of work. And then came the decision that changed the nature of the courtroom proceeding. D'Angelo agreed to plead guilty. In June 2020, he admitted responsibility for 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges. The plea agreement avoided a prolonged trial over every charged offense, but it did not silence the victims. Instead, the sentencing proceedings gave them an extraordinary opportunity. They could speak. They could describe what had happened. They could explain what the crimes had done to them. And they could address the man who had remained beyond their reach for decades. Their statements became a kind of reckoning. For years, the offender had possessed the power of anonymity. He had entered homes at night and controlled frightened victims through fear. Then, in the courtroom, that power was reversed. The survivors were no longer trapped in those rooms. They were standing in public, speaking in their own voice. They could describe the consequences without the offender controlling the circumstances. Their words also demonstrated why a cold case is never truly cold for the people who lived through it. Police files can be closed or archived. Detectives can retire. News stories can disappear from front pages. But trauma does not follow the same schedule. It can remain present for decades. The sentencing hearings revealed how much time the victims had spent carrying that burden. Some spoke about fear. Some spoke about anger. Some spoke about the ways the crimes changed their lives. Others focused on the fact that the offender had been allowed to lie freely while they lived with the consequences. The passage of time was everywhere in the courtroom. The young people who had once been targeted were now older. Some had become grandparents. Some had spent most of their adult lives waiting for this moment. The defendant himself was an elderly man. The physical contrast was almost surreal. The crimes belonged to an earlier California, but their consequences were standing in the courtroom in the present. And that was perhaps the most powerful message of the proceedings. Time had not erased the crime. It had only changed the people forced to live with them. When D'Angelo was sentenced in August 2020, the court imposed multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Legally, the case had reached its most definitive conclusion. The defendant would spend the rest of his life in prison, but emotionally, there was no simple ending. Justice could punish the offender. It could not resurrect the dead. It could not erase decades of fear. It could not return the lives that might have been lived differently if the crimes had never occurred. It could not give the victims back the years they spent wondering whether the man who attacked them was still somewhere nearby. The sentence was therefore both an ending and a reminder of what could never be undone. Yet the Golden State Killer investigation had achieved something extraordinary. It demonstrated that a case can survive its original era. Evidence collected decades earlier can become decisive when science catches up. An investigation that once seemed impossible can be reopened with a new strategy. A criminal who appears to have vanished can still leave a biological trail, and a family connection that seems insignificant can eventually lead investigators to the person they have been searching for. The breakthrough also changed the conversation surrounding cold cases around the world. Investigators began looking more closely at old DNA evidence. Genetic genealogy attracted enormous attention. Cases once considered nearly impossible to solve suddenly appeared to have another potential path forward. The Golden State Killer had become a symbol of what could happen when old evidence met new technology. But there was another lesson hidden inside the story. The technology mattered because someone had preserved the evidence in the first place. Without that biological material, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to serve. Without the investigators who collected and preserved it, the future would have had no bridge to the past. Every generation of investigators had contributed something. Some collected evidence without knowing whether it would ever identify the offender. Others connected crimes across jurisdictions. Others developed the forensic techniques needed to create the genetic profile. Others explored genealogy databases. Others followed the family tree. And others finally confronted the suspect. The solution was not created in a single afternoon. It was built over decades. That is what makes the case so remarkable. The Golden State Killer was not defeated by time. Time nearly buried the investigation. What defeated him was the fact that the evidence survived longer than his anonymity. He could grow older. He could move through ordinary life. He could wait for the investigation to fade. But the biological evidence remained. Somewhere inside a laboratory record was a genetic signature that had been waiting for the right technology. Somewhere inside the memories of survivors were details that had never disappeared. Somewhere inside old police files were connections that later investigators could finally understand. And eventually, those pieces converged. The man who had once seemed almost untouchable was identified. The case that had haunted California for decades was reopened. The survivors were heard. The families were given answers, and the courtroom finally recorded the responsibility that investigators had spent a lifetime trying to establish. But the story still carried one final question, one that went beyond Joseph James D'Angelo himself. How many years can pass before society decides that a crime is too old to solve? 10 years? 20? The Golden State Killer case offered a brutal answer. As long as evidence remains, the clock does not necessarily stop. A cold case may be silent, but silence is not the same as disappearance. Sometimes the answer is already there, waiting for someone to discover how to read it. And in this case, the message had been written in DNA decades before investigators were capable of understanding what it meant. For decades, the Golden State Killer had been defined by absence. There was no confirmed identity, no arrest, no courtroom, and no final explanation for why the crimes had suddenly stopped. There was only the evidence left behind and the lives left damaged. But once Joseph James D'Angelo pleaded guilty and received multiple life sentences, the investigation entered a different kind of darkness. The mystery had been solved, yet the full meaning of the case was still being examined. What had happened to the communities he terrorized? What had happened to the survivors during the 40 years when they did not know whether their attacker might return? And what did it mean for investigators who had spent their careers pursuing a man who seemed to have vanished? The answers were buried inside decades of consequences. When the attacks first began in the Sacramento area, the fear was immediate and intensely local. Residents heard warnings about an unknown man entering homes. Police officers went door to door. Newspapers carried descriptions and updates. People began changing the most ordinary parts of their lives. They checked windows before bed. They locked doors more carefully. They became aware of sounds outside their homes that they might once have ignored. The offender had transformed ordinary routines into potential threat. The psychological damage was not limited to the victims themselves. Entire neighborhoods felt exposed. People wondered whether the house next door had been watched. They wondered whether an unfamiliar vehicle had been connected to the crimes. They wondered whether the police knew more than they were saying. Fear spread through uncertainty because nobody could identify the man responsible. An unidentified offender can become more frightening than a known criminal because the imagination fills the gaps. Every unknown person becomes a possibility. Every shadow becomes a question. Every night becomes another opportunity for danger. Investigators understood this, which made the failure to identify the offender even more frustrating. They were not simply searching for a person. They were trying to restore a sense of safety to communities that had lost it. But the offender remained ahead of them. He moved carefully. He left behind evidence, but not enough to immediately reveal his identity. And eventually, the known attacks stopped. That sudden silence created a strange kind of uncertainty. If the offender had died, the danger was over. If he had been imprisoned for another crime, the danger was contained. If he had moved away, another community might have been at risk. If he had simply stopped, nobody could know whether the violence might begin again. Investigators could not close the case with confidence. They could only wait. Years passed. Then decades. The original East Area rapist investigation became part of California's criminal history. New detectives inherited the file. Old detectives retired. Technology changed. DNA became central to criminal investigation. The biological evidence connected to the crimes could now produce a profile, and that profile confirmed that multiple attacks had been committed by the same man. But the profile still did not identify him. The case had reached a strange technological paradox. Investigators knew more about the offender's biology than ever before, yet they still did not know his name. They could prove connections between crimes separated by geography and time. They could determine that the same genetic profile appeared across cases. But without a direct database match, the identity remained hidden. This was the moment when patience became essential. The investigation could easily have been forgotten. The files could have remained stored away. The evidence could have been treated as another unsolved mystery. Instead, investigators continued looking for new approaches. Genetic genealogy eventually provided the breakthrough. The method transformed the meaning of the DNA profile. Before genealogy, the question was simple: whose DNA is this? After genealogy, the question became much broader. Who in this person's family could be connected to this DNA? That change in perspective opened a path that had not existed before. A distant relative could reveal a common ancestor. A common ancestor could reveal a family branch. A family branch could reveal a generation, and a generation could eventually lead to a living person who fit the historical profile of the offender. But investigators had to be careful. A family connection was not proof. It was an investigative lead. The process required patience, verification, and traditional police work. Names had to be checked. Ages had to be considered. Locations had to make sense. The timeline had to fit. Eventually, Joseph James D'Angelo became the person investigators focused on. The biological connection was then confirmed through DNA obtained from him. That moment effectively ended the decades-long search. But it also created a disturbing realization. The man investigators had been hunting had not been living like a fugitive. He had apparently spent decades inside ordinary society. He had aged. He had experienced the passage of time like everyone else. Meanwhile, the survivors had carried memories of him. That contrast became especially powerful during the sentencing proceedings. D'Angelo's appearance had changed dramatically from the period when the crimes occurred. He was an elderly man in court, yet the people confronting him remembered a very different figure. They remembered the offender as he had been during the attacks. The years between those two images were filled with consequences. The survivors had not been able to simply grow old and leave the crimes behind. Many had built lives around the memories. Some had found ways to cope. Some had spoken publicly. Others had remained private. But the knowledge that the offender was still unidentified remained in the background. The arrest changed that. Suddenly, decades of uncertainty had a conclusion. The man they had feared was no longer anonymous. He could no longer disappear into the crowd. He was sitting in court, listening, and then the survivors spoke. Their victim impact statements became a crucial part of the final chapter. They described the lasting effects of the attacks, not simply what happened during the crimes, but what happened afterward. Fear can survive long after the physical danger has disappeared. A person may become cautious about who they trust. They may struggle with sleep. They may change the way they secure their home. They may remain alert to sounds that other people ignore. The consequences can become invisible to everyone except the person carrying them. For decades, those consequences had been part of the survivors' lives. Now they could explain them publicly. The courtroom gave them something the original crime scenes never could: control over the narrative. The offender could no longer dictate what happened. He could not enter a room unexpectedly. He could not hide his identity. He could not force victims into silence. They were standing before him on their own terms. The emotional reversal was enormous. The man who had once created fear through anonymity was now exposed through evidence and testimony. Women and men who had once been isolated inside their homes were surrounded by supporters, attorneys, investigators, journalists, and members of their community. The silence that had protected the offender for decades had been broken. But there was still another dimension to the case. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated how deeply jurisdictional boundaries can affect criminal investigation. The crimes occurred across different areas of California, and different law enforcement agencies were involved. At the beginning, the full pattern was not immediately visible. A crime in one jurisdiction might appear separate from a crime somewhere else. Over time, information was compared, patterns were recognized, and investigators realized that apparently different offenders were actually the same man. That process required cooperation and persistence. It also showed why cold cases can remain unresolved even when investigators possess significant evidence. A case can be blocked not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence has not yet been connected in the right way. The Golden State Killer's crimes were eventually understood as part of a much larger pattern. The name itself became a symbol of that realization. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer were different labels attached to different periods and locations of the same investigation. For years, the labels reflected uncertainty. After D'Angelo's identification, they became connected. The fragmented story became one story. That connection mattered to survivors because it confirmed something that had been suspected for decades. The person responsible for their suffering was not a collection of unrelated offenders. It was one man whose criminal history extended across California. The realization was horrifying, but it also provided clarity. Investigators could finally place individual crimes within the larger pattern. Families could understand that their loved ones were part of a case that had been investigated for decades. The public could finally understand the scale of what had happened, and researchers could study how the investigation had evolved from traditional detective work into modern forensic genealogy. Yet the most important evidence remained remarkably simple. Biological material collected long ago. That evidence had survived while everything else changed. Police departments changed. Investigators changed. Technology changed. The suspect grew old. The survivors grew old. But the DNA remained capable of telling the same story. It had no memory of the passage of time. It did not become weaker simply because decades had passed. It waited for the tools capable of interpreting it. This became one of the defining lessons of the case. A cold case is not necessarily an empty case. Sometimes it is a case filled with evidence that has not yet found its answer. The Golden State Killer investigation proved that old evidence can become new evidence when science advances. It also showed why preservation mattered. Had crucial biological material been lost, contaminated, or destroyed, the genetic genealogy breakthrough might never have happened. The eventual solution depended on evidence surviving long enough to meet a technology that did not exist when the crimes occurred. That idea extended beyond California. After the Golden State Killer arrest, investigators around the country began looking again at unsolved cases involving unidentified DNA. Genetic genealogy became one of the most discussed developments in forensic investigation. Cases that had remained dormant for decades suddenly appeared to have possibilities. Investigators began asking whether old evidence could be re-examined through new methods. The Golden State Killer case had changed expectations. It had shown that an unknown offender could remain unidentified for 40 years and still be found. But the breakthrough also raised difficult questions about privacy, genetic databases, and the boundaries of investigative genealogy. The technology was powerful because it could reveal family relationships. That same power meant that people who had never been suspects could become relevant to an investigation through distant genetic connections. The debate would continue, but the forensic impact of the case was undeniable. The Golden State Killer had become one of the clearest examples of how genealogy could bridge the gap between an unidentified DNA profile and a living suspect. Still, technology alone did not solve the case. Someone had to recognize that the technology could be used differently. Someone had to build the family tree. Someone had to investigate the candidates. Someone had to obtain the direct DNA sample. Someone had to make the arrest. And before all of that, someone had to preserve the evidence. The breakthrough was therefore the product of generations of work. Detectives from the original investigations had no way of knowing whether the material they collected would identify the offender. They simply knew that evidence mattered. Decades later, their decision proved critical. The case became a message to investigators working on unsolved crimes everywhere. Never assume that an old case is beyond the reach of future science. The Golden State Killer had remained hidden because the right answer did not exist yet. When the answer finally became possible, the evidence was waiting, and that was perhaps the most chilling reality of all. For more than 40 years, the killer had lived under the illusion that time had protected him. But time had also preserved the trail that would eventually lead investigators to his door. He could outlive detectives. He could outlive headlines. He could outlive public attention. He could watch the world move forward while the case seemed to fade into history. But he could not outlive the evidence. In the end, the trail did not disappear. It simply waited for someone to learn how to follow it. The most extraordinary part of the Golden State Killer investigation was not simply that Joseph James D'Angelo was eventually identified. It was that the evidence capable of identifying him had existed for decades while the world around it changed. The police officers who first investigated the crimes could not have known that a future generation would look at the same biological material through an entirely different scientific lens. They could not have known that ordinary people would one day submit their DNA to ancestry databases and unknowingly create connections that investigators could use to build a family tree. They could not have known that a case which seemed almost frozen in time would eventually become one of the most important examples of forensic genealogy in modern criminal investigation. Yet, that is exactly what happened. The Golden State Killer had relied on darkness, uncertainty, and time. In the end, time became part of the reason he was caught. The evidence survived longer than his anonymity. For the survivors, however, the passage of time was not an abstract concept. It was their lives. When the original attacks occurred, many of them were young. They had decades ahead of them. They could not know that the investigation would continue for most of their adult lives. They could not know that the man who had entered their homes would grow old somewhere in California while they carried the memory of what he had done. They could not know that one day they would see his face on television and hear investigators announce that the search was over. The years between the crime and the arrest were filled with ordinary life. People married. Children were born. Families moved. Careers began and ended. Parents became grandparents. Some survivors chose never to discuss the crimes publicly. Others found strength in telling their stories. Some continued following the case whenever another investigative development appeared. Others tried to put it behind them, but the uncertainty remained. An unsolved crime does not simply occupy a police file. It occupies a space in the mind of everyone connected to it. There is always a question waiting somewhere in the background. Who did this? Why did it happen? Is the person still alive? Is the person still free? Will anyone ever know? For the families of murder victims, those questions can become permanent. There is no ordinary ending to a life taken by an unidentified killer. Without an arrest, the family may never know whether justice is possible without a conviction. There is no final legal acknowledgement of responsibility. Without an identified suspect, even the basic story of what happened can remain incomplete. The Golden State Killer case carried that uncertainty across decades. Then the arrest suddenly changed the emotional landscape. The man investigators believed responsible was no longer an unknown figure. He was Joseph James D'Angelo. His age made the discovery even more remarkable. He had been 72 when arrested. The man associated with crimes committed when California looked completely different was now an elderly defendant. The passage of time was visible in his face, but for the survivors, his age did not erase the past. A person can become old without becoming innocent of what prosecutors say he did decades earlier. The courtroom therefore became a place where two timelines collided. One timeline belonged to the crimes, the other belonged to the present. The young victims of the 1970s and 80s were now older adults. The alleged offender was also elderly. Yet the emotional consequences of those old crimes remained immediate. When D'Angelo pleaded guilty in 2020, the legal system moved towards its final judgment. But the most significant moments were not necessarily the formal legal arguments. They were the moments when survivors spoke. Their statements transformed the case from a story about forensic technology into a story about human endurance. They described the ways the crimes had followed them. They described fear that could return unexpectedly. They described the difficulty of trusting the safety of their own home. They described what it meant to know that the person responsible had remained free for decades. Their words also exposed the limits of the phrase cold case. To investigators, a case may become cold when active leads disappear. To survivors, there is nothing cold about it. The memory remains alive. The fear remains alive. The unanswered question remains alive. A case can be dormant in a filing cabinet while being painfully present in someone's life. The Golden State Killer investigation showed that distinction with extraordinary force. It also demonstrated why victim testimony remains essential, even in cases dominated by DNA. Genetic evidence can establish identity. It can connect a person to biological material. It can create a powerful forensic link. But DNA cannot describe what a survivor felt when the offender entered the room. It cannot explain the psychological impact of losing the feeling of safety. It cannot tell a family what their loved one might have experienced during the final moments of a life that was taken. Evidence can establish facts. Survivors give those facts meaning. That became especially clear during sentencing. D'Angelo's guilty plea removed the uncertainty surrounding the outcome of the charged crimes, but the victim still had something to say. The courtroom became a place of confrontation, not because the survivors needed to prove that they had suffered, but because the suffering had been hidden for too long behind statistics and case numbers. Each victim had a name. Each had a family. Each had a life before the crime. Each had a life afterward. The Golden State Killer had created fear through anonymity, but the survivors dismantled that anonymity through testimony. They described what he had done and what remained after he was gone. Their words made the passage of time visible. 40 years was not simply a number. It was for decades of living with a secret that had no resolution. It was decades of wondering whether the offender might someday be identified. It was decades in which the survivors had to create their own forms of closure because the justice system could not provide one. Then genetic genealogy changed everything. The technology did not erase those decades. It simply opened the locked door that had kept the investigation from reaching a conclusion. The genealogy process itself was extraordinary because it turned the concept of family history into an investigative tool. Traditional DNA searches ask whether a profile matches a known person. Genetic genealogy can ask a different question. What biological family might this unknown person belong to? That distinction allowed investigators to search beyond the boundaries of law enforcement databases. A distant relative could become a clue. A shared ancestor could reveal a branch of a family. A branch could narrow the possibilities. Eventually, the investigation could focus on a specific individual. In D'Angelo's case, that individual was not immediately accused simply because of genealogy. Investigators still had to verify the lead. They followed him. They obtained DNA from him. They compared the sample with the crime scene profile. The genetic evidence provided the direct connection necessary to move forward. This combination of modern genetics and traditional detective work became one of the most important aspects of the case. It demonstrated that technology does not replace investigators. It gives them new ways to ask questions. A DNA profile that had once seemed like a dead end became an entry point. The family tree did not solve the case by itself. It gave detectives a direction. The detectives then had to do the rest. They had to establish whether the candidate fit the historical timeline. They had to confirm his identity. They had to obtain a sample. They had to compare the genetic evidence. They had to build a prosecutable case. And eventually, they had to bring him before a judge. The result changed the way law enforcement viewed old, unsolved crime. If a biological profile existed, the possibility of identification could remain alive even when decades had passed. That was a profound shift. Before the Golden State Killer arrest, a 40-year-old case could appear almost impossible. Afterward, investigators around the country began asking whether their own cold cases might contain similar opportunities. Old DNA profiles were reconsidered. Evidence that had once seemed insufficient suddenly became potentially valuable. The concept of genetic genealogy moved from relative obscurity into the center of public discussion. But with that power came questions. Genetic genealogy depends on information contributed by people who may never have imagined that their DNA could help identify a distant relative connected to a criminal investigation. The technology can reveal relationships that extend far beyond the individual who submitted the sample. It can uncover family structures and biological connections that people did not know existed. The Golden State Killer case therefore became not only a landmark in forensic science, but also part of a larger debate about genetic privacy. How should these databases be used? What rules should govern law enforcement access? How distant can a relative be before the connection becomes meaningful? What safeguards should exist? These questions did not erase the value of the technology, but they demonstrated that every scientific breakthrough creates new responsibility. Still, for the survivors of the Golden State Killer, the central issue was much simpler. The man was finally identified. The decades of uncertainty had an answer. The fear of an unknown offender was replaced by the knowledge that he was in custody. For families who had lost loved ones, there was finally a legal conclusion. The sentence could not change history, but it could establish accountability. D'Angelo would spend the rest of his life in prison. The man who had once moved through California unseen would never again be free to disappear into an ordinary neighborhood. His anonymity was gone. His crimes were documented. His identity was part of the public record, and the evidence that revealed him had become a symbol of persistence. Yet the case also revealed something darker about the passage of time. The Golden State Killer had benefited from the limitations of the era in which he committed his crime. Modern investigators had tools that the original detectives could not have imagined, but the victims never received the benefit of modern technology when they needed it most. They had to survive without knowing whether the person who attacked them would ever be caught. They had to live through decades of uncertainty while science slowly developed the ability to answer the question. That reality makes the case both inspiring and painful. It demonstrates what technology can accomplish, but it also reminds us what was lost while that technology did not yet exist. The Golden State Killer was eventually found because the evidence survived. But the victims had to survive too. Their endurance was the human counterpart to the preserved DNA. One waited in a laboratory, the others waited in life. And when the two finally met, the mystery that had haunted California for more than 40 years could finally be brought into the light. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had existed as an unanswered question. But after the arrest and guilty plea of Joseph James D'Angelo, another question remained. What could justice possibly look like after so much time had passed? The crimes had happened in another era. The original investigators had long since left the force. Some had retired. Some had died. The victims had grown older. Families had changed. California itself had changed. Yet the evidence had survived, waiting for a moment when science could finally turn an unknown DNA profile into a living identity. That moment had arrived in 2018, but the emotional consequences would continue long after the headlines faded. For the people who had lived through the crimes, the arrest was not simply the conclusion of a mystery, it was the return of something they had spent decades trying to leave behind. When news broke that a suspect had been arrested, survivors who had once believed the case might never be solved suddenly had to confront an extraordinary reality. The man they remembered was no longer an unidentified predator. Investigators had identified him as Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer who had lived for decades in California. The name appeared in newspapers and on television. His face appeared beside descriptions of crimes that had once terrified entire communities. The Golden State Killer had finally become a person, but the transformation from unidentified offender to accused murderer did not happen because investigators suddenly found a forgotten confession or an eyewitness who had kept a secret for 40 years. It happened because the biological evidence had survived long enough to meet a new generation of forensic science. That distinction became critical. The original investigators had done their work without knowing whether the evidence they collected would ever produce an answer. They could not see the future. They could only preserve what they found and document what they could. Decades later, those decisions became the foundation of the breakthrough. The DNA profile recovered from evidence connected to the crimes had already demonstrated that multiple offenses were linked to the same male offender. But a genetic profile without a name was still an incomplete answer. Traditional law enforcement databases did not provide the match investigators needed. The offender's DNA was effectively isolated. Then, genetic genealogy created a new route. Investigators could search for relatives of the unknown person rather than searching only for the person himself. It was a subtle change in strategy with enormous consequences. A relative did not need to know the offender. The relative did not need to have any connection to the crime. The relative only needed to share enough genetic ancestry to help investigators construct a family tree. From there, traditional genealogy could narrow the possibilities. Names emerged, generations could be traced, families could be reconstructed. Investigators could ask which individuals had lived in California during the relevant years and fit the offender's approximate age and other known characteristics. The process eventually pointed toward D'Angelo, but detectives did not simply accept the genealogy result and declare the case solved. They needed confirmation. They needed direct biological evidence from the suspect. That meant watching D'Angelo without revealing that he was under investigation. The goal was to obtain DNA from an item he had discarded. Once investigators obtained the sample, forensic analysis produced the connection they needed. The genetic evidence linked D'Angelo to the crime scene profile. The decades-old investigation had finally crossed the line from suspicion to identification. On April 24, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights. He was 72 years old. That detail alone seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The offender investigators had hunted for more than 40 years, had aged into old age while the investigation remained unresolved. The arrest photographs created an unsettling contrast with the image of the Golden State Killer that had existed in the public imagination. The killer had once been represented by descriptions, sketches, and feats. Now there was a real man sitting in custody. Yet the arrest did not answer every question. Investigators still had to establish the extent of D'Angelo's criminal responsibility. The case involved multiple murders and numerous sexual assaults attributed to the same offender. Prosecutors had to organize evidence accumulated over decades. They had to determine which crimes could be charged and how the evidence could be presented. They also had to consider the people at the center of the case, survivors and families who had been waiting for answers for most of their adult lives. The passage of time created an unusual legal and emotional landscape. In many criminal cases, witnesses testify about events that happened months or perhaps a few years earlier. Here, some of the relevant events had happened more than 4 decades before the courtroom proceeding. Memories had been carried across an entire generation. A person who had been young during the attacks might now have grandchildren. A family member who had been a child when a relative was murdered might now be elderly. The defendant himself had transformed from a middle-aged man into a 72-year-old. The courtroom therefore contained people separated by decades but connected by the same history. The guilty plea in June 2020 changed the proceedings again. D'Angelo admitted responsibility for 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges. The plea avoided a full trial on every charged crime, but it did not prevent survivors and relatives from telling their story. Instead, the sentencing proceedings became an extraordinary public confrontation with the consequences of the crime. Survivor statements demonstrated that the case had never been merely about an unidentified offender. It had always been about people. People whose lives were divided into before and after. People who had spent years adapting to fear. People who had wondered whether the killer might still be alive. People who had watched the investigation go cold and wondered whether justice would ever arrive. Their words also challenged the idea that time automatically heals every wound. Time changes circumstances. It changes appearances. It changes technology. But it does not necessarily erase trauma. The Golden State Killer's victims had lived through decades of change while carrying memories that belonged to a different California. Some had built lives that were entirely separate from the crime. Others continued to follow developments in the investigation, but the absence of an identified offender remained part of their story. The arrest brought an answer that many had stopped expecting. It also created a complicated mixture of relief, anger, grief, and disbelief. Relief because the offender was finally in custody. Anger because so much time had passed. Grief because no arrest could restore those who had been murdered. Disbelief because the man they had feared was now an elderly defendant. And perhaps, for some, a sense of vindication because the crimes had finally been formally acknowledged. The courtroom became the place where those emotions could exist together. The victims were not required to pretend that the passage of time had made the crimes less significant. Instead, they could describe how those crimes had continued to affect them. The statements became a record of consequences that could never be captured by DNA results alone. Genetic evidence could tell investigators that D'Angelo was connected to biological material from the crimes. It could help establish identity, but it could not describe the fear of lying awake at night, wondering whether an intruder might return. It could not describe the emotional impact of losing trust in one's own home. It could not describe the grief of a family whose loved one was murdered. Those details belonged to the survivors. Their testimony transformed the case from forensic history into human history. It also made clear why the Golden State Killer investigation mattered far beyond one defendant. The case demonstrated how modern forensic science could revive investigations that had seemed permanently stalled. Cold cases around the country suddenly appeared in a different light. If investigators had preserved biological evidence, there was always a possibility that future technology could provide an answer. Genetic genealogy became a powerful new investigative method, particularly in cases involving unidentified DNA profiles. But the method also raised serious questions about privacy and consent. Traditional criminal databases contain information collected primarily for law enforcement purposes. Genealogy databases may contain information voluntarily submitted by members of the public for entirely different reasons. A person may upload DNA because they want to discover their ancestry, identify relatives, or explore family history. They may never imagine that their genetic information could eventually help investigators identify a distant relative suspected of a decades-old crime. The Golden State Killer case brought these issues into public awareness. The technology was undeniably powerful, but power requires limits, oversight, and careful consideration of privacy. The investigation also demonstrated that genealogy alone was not enough. Investigators still needed traditional police work. They needed to verify identities. They needed to examine records. They needed to establish timelines. They needed to obtain a direct sample. They needed to confirm the genetic connection. The family tree pointed toward D'Angelo, but the evidence had to be developed carefully before authorities could make an arrest. That combination of old-fashioned detective work and modern genetic science became one of the defining features of the case. It was not technology replacing investigation. It was technology expanding what investigation could accomplish. The case also demonstrated the importance of cooperation across jurisdictions. The crimes had originally been investigated under different names and in different regions. Over time, investigators recognized that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same offender. That realization helped create the broader understanding represented by the name Golden State Killer. Without connecting the cases, investigators would have been looking at fragments rather than a complete pattern. The eventual identification of D'Angelo allowed the fragments to be assembled into one history. The result was both horrifying and clarifying. The crimes were not isolated incidents committed by unrelated offenders. They were part of a long pattern attributed to one man. That recognition mattered to victims and families because it provided a coherent explanation for crimes that had once seemed disconnected. It also helped investigators understand the scale of the offender's activity. Yet even after the case was solved, unanswered questions remained about crimes that could not be formally charged or proven. A criminal investigation does not automatically produce complete knowledge of everything an offender may have done. There are cases where evidence is insufficient, witnesses are unavailable, or records have been lost. The Golden State Killer investigation was vast, but the legal case could only encompass crimes supported by the evidence and charges prosecutors chose to pursue. That reality is another reminder that solving a cold case does not mean discovering every detail. It means reaching the strongest conclusion the evidence can support. In this case, that conclusion was devastating. D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges and received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The legal system had finally imposed a definitive consequence, but the passage of 40 years meant that justice could never be separated from loss. The victims had lost time. Families had lost loved ones. Survivors had lost the sense of safety that should have belonged inside their own home. No sentence could reverse those losses. What the sentence could do was end the uncertainty. The Golden State Killer would not walk free again. The identity that had eluded investigators for decades was now permanently attached to the case, and the evidence that had waited silently through generations had finally spoken. It had taken more than 40 years, but the biological trail had led investigators from an unknown man to a family, from a family to a suspect, and from a suspect to a courtroom. The killer had spent decades relying on anonymity. In the end, anonymity was exactly what the evidence destroyed. The sentence brought a formal end to one of the longest criminal investigations in California history, but it did not erase the question that had followed the case for generations. How had Joseph James D'Angelo managed to remain unidentified for so long? The answer was not a single mistake, a single failed witness, or one extraordinary act of deception. It was the result of a world that had changed dramatically while the evidence remained trapped in the limitations of its time. When the crimes began, investigators did not have the forensic tools that would eventually make the arrest possible. There was no widespread DNA profiling. There were no genealogy databases filled with millions of voluntarily submitted genetic profiles. There was no ability to search family relationships across generations from an unknown biological sample. Detectives worked with what they had. They collected physical evidence. They interviewed victims. They searched neighborhoods. They compared reports. They built descriptions of an offender whose identity remained hidden. Every investigation generated information, but none of it produced the final name. Then the years began to accumulate. 10 years became 20. 20 became 30. 30 became 40. The case changed names as investigators learned more about the crimes. The East Area rapist became associated with the Sacramento attacks. The original Night Stalker became associated with crimes in Southern California. Eventually, investigators understood that these apparently separate offenders were one man. The name Golden State Killer captured the broader pattern. But a name was not an identity. It described the mystery. It did not solve it. For the people who had lived through the attacks, that distinction was enormous. Knowing that the same man was responsible for crimes across California did not tell them who he was. It did not tell them where he lived. It did not tell them whether they had ever passed him in a supermarket or stood behind him in a line. The possibility that the offender could be living an ordinary life somewhere in the state remained deeply unsettling. He had become a ghost with a biological signature. Investigators knew his DNA. They did not know his face. They knew the crimes. They did not know his name. They knew the pattern. They did not know where the pattern ended. That uncertainty continued until genetic genealogy changed the investigation. The breakthrough was remarkable because it did not begin with a new crime. It began with old evidence. Investigators returned to the biological material that had been preserved from earlier cases and used modern forensic techniques to create and examine the unknown DNA profile. The profile was entered into appropriate investigative processes, but there was still no direct identification. Traditional searches had reached their limit. Then investigators turned to genetic genealogy. The strategy was fundamentally different. Instead of asking whether the offender's DNA matched a known criminal, investigators searched for relatives who shared portions of the genetic profile. The logic was simple but powerful. If the unknown offender had relatives whose DNA appeared in a genealogy database, those connections might reveal a family tree. The family tree could then be traced backward and forward through generations. Investigators could identify branches. They could eliminate people who did not fit. They could focus on individuals who matched the age, location, and other known characteristics of the offender. It was not a shortcut. It was a new road, and roads still require someone to follow them. Investigators worked through genealogical information and eventually identified D'Angelo as a person of interest. But the fact that his name appeared in the investigative process did not automatically make him the Golden State Killer. The case still required evidence that could stand in court. Detectives followed D'Angelo. They observed him. They searched for an opportunity to collect discarded biological material. When investigators obtained a sample that could be compared with the crime scene DNA, the result was decisive. The genetic evidence linked D'Angelo to the profile that had haunted investigators for decades. At that instant, the case changed from a search for an unknown offender to an investigation of a specific man. It was a moment built on decades of work. The evidence had survived. The science had advanced. The genealogy had created a path. Traditional detective work had confirmed it. And on April 24th, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested. The news moved quickly. The Golden State Killer had finally been identified, but the arrest produced an emotional reaction unlike an ordinary criminal investigation because the case had existed for so long that many people had assumed the mystery might never be solved. For some survivors, the announcement was almost unbelievable. They had lived most of their lives without knowing who had attacked them. Now the offender had a name and was in custody. For investigators who had inherited the case, the moment represented something even larger. They had solved a mystery that had defeated generations of detectives, but solving it did not mean that the investigation was finished. Prosecutors now had to determine how to proceed against a 72-year-old defendant accused of crimes dating back decades. The evidence was extensive, but the legal process had to account for the age of the cases, the age of witnesses, and the number of crimes involved. The prosecution ultimately filed charges for multiple murders and kidnapping-related offenses. The case moved toward trial, and for a time, it appeared that survivors might have to endure a lengthy courtroom process in which the evidence from decades earlier would be presented in detail. Then, D'Angelo pleaded guilty. His decision changed the entire direction of the proceedings. In June 2020, he admitted responsibility for 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges. The plea agreement allowed the prosecution to avoid a lengthy trial while still securing a severe sentence, but it also opened the door for survivors and families to speak. The sentencing proceedings became a powerful confrontation between the past and the present. D'Angelo sat before people whose lives had been changed by crimes committed when he was decades younger. He was now an elderly man. His victims were also older. Some had spent almost their entire adult lives carrying the memory. The physical appearance of the courtroom could not have been more different from the crime scenes of the 1970s and 80s. There were no dark streets, no quiet houses, no frightened neighbors listening for footsteps. There was simply a courtroom. But for the people speaking there, the past remained present. Their victim impact statements showed that the crimes had never truly ended when the offender left their homes. The physical attacks were over. The psychological consequences were not. Survivors described the long shadow that followed them, the loss of security, the fear that could return without warning, the difficulty of trusting, the knowledge that the person responsible had remained free for decades. The statements also exposed something that statistics could never capture. The Golden State Killer case was often described through numbers. The number of attacks, the number of murders, the number of decades, the number of jurisdictions involved. But behind every number was an individual life. Every victim had a family. Every survivor had a future that had been forced to continue under the weight of something they had never chosen. Every murder left people behind who had to continue living without the person they loved. The courtroom gave those individual stories a place in the official history of the case. For decades, the offender had been the center of the mystery because nobody knew who he was. Now, the survivors became the center of the final chapter. Their voices changed the meaning of the investigation. This was no longer simply a story about an elusive criminal and the technology that finally exposed him. It was a story about people who had waited, people who had survived, people who had carried memories that the rest of the world had largely forgotten. The sentencing also revealed the strange cruelty of time. The Golden State Killer had been able to live through decades without facing the consequences of the crimes. He had experienced ordinary moments that his victims could never recover. He had grown older while families continued to grieve. He had watched the world change while survivors continued to live with what he had done. The passage of time had protected him legally and practically in many ways, but it had not erased the evidence. That evidence had been waiting all along. In August 2020, D'Angelo received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence was final. There would be no return to ordinary life, no possibility of release, no opportunity for the man once known only through a terrifying nickname to disappear again. The courtroom had accomplished what investigators had spent decades trying to achieve: accountability. Yet the sentence also carried an unavoidable truth. Justice had arrived late. It had arrived after more than 40 years. For some victims, that meant the person they had been waiting to see in court was almost unrecognizable from the man they remembered. For others, the age of the defendant made the moment even more surreal. The offender had been young enough to commit the crimes and old enough to become a grandfather before the law finally caught up with him. That contrast became one of the defining images of the case. The Golden State Killer had not been stopped by a dramatic chase through the streets. He had not been captured immediately after a final attack. He had been identified decades later through a combination of preserved evidence, modern science, genealogy, and patient detective work. His downfall was quiet compared with the terror associated with his crimes. There was no final confrontation at a crime scene. There was a DNA sample. There was a family tree. There was a police investigation. And there was a knock on a door in California. That was enough to end 40 years of uncertainty. But the broader significance of the case extended far beyond D'Angelo. Investigators around the country began looking at their own cold cases differently. Old biological evidence was no longer necessarily viewed as obsolete. A sample collected decades earlier could potentially become useful again. A case that had produced no match through traditional databases could potentially be approached through genetic genealogy. The lesson was both hopeful and unsettling. Hopeful because unsolved cases might still have answers hidden inside them. Unsettling because the same technology that could identify killers could also expose genetic relationships that ordinary people had never expected to reveal. The Golden State Killer case therefore became a turning point in the conversation about forensic genealogy. It showed what the technology could accomplish, but it also forced society to ask how far investigators should be allowed to go when using genetic information. Those questions would continue long after D'Angelo's sentencing. But for the victims and their families, the most important question had already been answered. The man they had waited decades to identify had been found. The mystery had a name. The evidence had a conclusion. The courtroom had delivered a sentence, and the case that once seemed destined to remain